Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we're going somewhere colder than your landlord's heart in November. A land of mist, mud, and people who thought painting themselves blue was an appropriate life choice. Yes, we're heading back to ancient Celtic Europe, Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Britain. About 2,000 years ago, when the nights were long, the hills were windy, and Wi-Fi was mostly just smoke signals from your neighbor's bonfire. You're about to discover how an ancient farming festival called Samhain, spelled like someone sneezed halfway through writing, quietly transformed into what we now call Halloween. It was a time when the world tilted into darkness, when people gathered around massive fires, sacrificed the occasional unlucky vegetable, and tried their best not to annoy the local ghosts. Before we begin, a gentle call to action, because even druids need engagement. If you enjoy drifting into sleep while listening to mildly cursed history lessons, go ahead and tap that like button. Do it softly, the way a ghost might knock on a wooden door, politely but with intent. And of course, subscribe, so you can join us every week as we tuck ourselves in beneath the heavy quilt of historical nonsense. Now, take a deep breath. Imagine rolling green hills under a bruised grey sky. The air smells like wet grass and burning peat. You hear sheep bleating in the distance, as if they know they're about to be symbolically important. In a nearby valley, villagers drag timber and kindling into a pile that looks more like a giant funeral pyre than a party centerpiece. This was Samhain, the night when summer died and winter was born. To the Celts, it wasn't just the end of a season. It was the end of the light half of the year itself. The world was turning inward. The soil was going to sleep, and every living thing prepared for months of cold, hunger, and questionable fashion choices made entirely of wool. But more importantly, it was believed that on this night, and this night only, the veil between worlds grew thin. The dead could walk among the living. Ancestors came home. Spirits wandered the roads, and everyone just accepted that as normal. It wasn't a horror story. It was hospitality. People left food and drink outside for wandering souls, hoping the ghosts would take the snacks and not, the livestock. Fires were lit to guide them, or to scare them, or possibly both, depending on how confident you felt in your ghost etiquette. It's strange to think about now that once upon a time, death wasn't seen as something separate or taboo. It was part of the yearly rhythm, like taxes or seasonal depression. When the earth turned dark, people faced it together, not with fear, but with ritual, music, and some truly unsettling masks. Picture it: villagers dancing around a roaring fire, sparks rising into the ink-black sky, children clutching hands, wide-eyed, druids in cloaks muttering incantations that probably sounded like half poetry, half tax code, and in the background, the faint sound of livestock making nervous eye contact with the butcher. This wasn't chaos, it was order disguised as madness. A way for the Celts to say, "We see you, darkness. We respect you. Please don't ruin our harvest or kill our favorite cow." It was a night of balance, between life and death, warmth and cold, certainty and mystery. And yet, for all its solemnity, Samhain also had the unmistakable energy of a village party. People drank, feasted, and told ghost stories that made just enough sense to be unsettling. Bonfires blazed like miniature suns on the hills, and for a few precious hours, the dark world felt alive, glowing, breathing, dangerous, and deeply human. Historians later wrote that these gatherings were the foundation of community, law, and seasonal survival. But honestly, it was probably just an excuse to stay up late and gossip about who forgot to bless their sheep properly. Still, the beauty of Samhain lies in its simplicity. It's the acknowledgement that endings matter, that the death of a season deserves ceremony. The Celts weren't afraid of the dark. They invited it in, offered it mead, and asked politely not to be devoured. And as we drift back there now, to a time before pumpkin spice, before candy wrappers and plastic skeletons, we find something strangely familiar. The same longing to make sense of what we can't see. The same comfort in light against the void. The same need to feel connected, even if the connection is with something wearing a ghostly grin. So, settle in. Pull your blanket close. Let the flicker of the imaginary fire warm your thoughts, and listen. Because tonight, we're not just talking about the origins of Halloween. We're wandering into the heart of ancient fear, ancient faith, and ancient fun. The fires are lit. The air smells like earth and mystery. The first spark of winter dances in the wind. And somewhere across the veil, the dead are leaning in, curious to see if we still remember them. Welcome to Samhain, where the year ends, the night begins, and the living learn to laugh softly in the face of darkness. Close your eyes and drift back 2,000 years to a landscape of rolling green hills and cold breath hanging in the air like faint smoke. The crops are gathered, the daylight is thinning, and somewhere in the distance, a horn sounds across a valley that smells of peat and rain. It isn't a warning, it's a summons. Tonight is Samhain, the hinge of the year, when summer gives its final sigh, and the world politely hands the keys to winter. To the ancient Celts, this wasn't just a date on a calendar, it was the calendar. The year began and ended with Samhain, because life itself began and ended with the harvest. When the last sheaf of grain fell, the earth went quiet, and people braced for months of hunger, darkness, and family togetherness, which is historically one of humanity's most terrifying conditions. Everything alive seemed to pause. Birds migrated, trees stripped down to skeletons. Even the rivers slowed, as if they too were waiting to see whether the sun would come back. And in that stillness, people felt something stirring. A thinness in the air, like the world had exhaled too hard and torn a seam between here and elsewhere. That seam was the veil, and on this night it wavered. The living and the dead could visit each other without passports, and that was both comforting and slightly inconvenient. The Celts didn't picture ghosts as horror movie jump scares. They imagined them as relatives who'd overstayed the afterlife. You greeted them with food, drink, and a respectful tone. You did not make eye contact for too long, in case they remembered an unpaid debt. Villages prepared for weeks. Cattle were herded from summer pastures, and anyone not yet inside the palisade by sunset was probably eaten by wolves, spirits, or disappointment. Women brewed ale that smelled like bread and bravery. Children gathered sticks and kindling. And the elders, those who had seen more winters than they could count, told stories of what waited in the dark. The ancestors, the fair folk, and the occasional shape-shifting neighbour you'd always suspected of being suspiciously good at gardening. When night fell, every hearth was extinguished. Darkness swallowed the huts, the fields, the hills. Then, at the highest point above the settlement, the great fire was born, a pillar of light spearing through the fog. Sparks rose like golden bees into the cold sky. Around it, hundreds of figures gathered, faces half hidden behind masks of bone, fur, or soot. The air hissed and roared. Shadows danced on the grass like restless souls stretching their legs. Each household brought an ember from that sacred flame to relight its own hearth. It was symbolic renewal, yes, but also a practical way to avoid freezing to death. Fire was survival, and survival was sacred. People believed that by sharing one blaze, they shared protection, a communal firewall against whatever wandered out of the darkness. Somewhere near the edge of the crowd, a druid, part priest, part weather forecaster, part general overthinker, raised his arms and declared that the world was entering the dark half of the year. His speech was equal parts theology and performance art. He might have spoken of cycles and spirits, or simply reminded everyone to store their barley correctly. Either way, the audience applauded, partly out of piety, and partly because their fingers were numb. After the blessings came the feasting. Boar, bread, and beer were passed around, and the line between reverence and revelry dissolved faster than a ghost in daylight. Laughter mingled with chanting. Flutes squealed. Someone accidentally caught a sleeve on fire, establishing the first recorded instance of festival insurance. And through it all, people left little offerings beyond the ring of light. Bowls of milk, pieces of bread, sometimes a shiny trinket. These were gifts for wandering spirits. Thank yous for keeping the living company. If the gifts were ignored by morning, everyone pretended it was fine. If they were gone, everyone pretended not to notice how cold the wind suddenly felt. There was no single emotion to Samhain. It wasn't fear or joy or grief. It was all of them. It was the realization that endings could be beautiful, that the same soil that swallowed the crops would cradle them again next spring. The Celts lived close enough to nature to see death as a season, not a tragedy. Samhain was their annual reminder that nothing truly vanished. It just changed address. As the night deepened, families huddled close, listening to the crackle of the dying fire. Smoke curled toward the stars, carrying prayers for protection, for warmth, for a winter merciful enough to let everyone complain about it in the spring. Somewhere out on the moor, a fox barked, or maybe an ancestor laughed, hard to tell through the mist. By dawn, the fire was embers. People gathered their glowing coals, wrapped them carefully, and trudged home through dew-silver grass. Behind them, the hilltop smoldered like the heart of a sleeping giant. Ahead of them waited frost, famine, and family, but also faith that the light would return, that the dead were friendly, and that next Samhain they'd stand together again beneath another roaring sky. So the year died quietly. The fields emptied, and across that thin, invisible line between worlds, the dead were full of stories, and perhaps a little envy, for those still breathing in the smoke of the living. And as you breathe slower now, listening to the last hiss of those ancient embers, remember, every end the Celts celebrated was just another beginning in disguise. The fire still burns. You can almost hear it. That low, hungry sound of logs collapsing into themselves, sparks flying up like little thoughts that forgot what they were trying to say. Around it, the people of the village shuffle closer, faces orange in the glow, shadows breathing on the grass behind them. This is Samhain at its brightest and its strangest. Halfway between ceremony and party, religion and improv theatre. Bonfires, for the Celts, weren't just big fires. They were cosmic customer service lines, glowing channels through which messages could travel between worlds. Fire connected the sky, the soil, and the underworld in one long, flickering column of heat, Each flame was a whispered prayer, each crackle a long-distance call to the gods. If you stood close enough, the warmth felt like faith itself. If you stood too close, you became an example. According to later chroniclers, Roman ones naturally, the druids organized these great blazes with what could generously be called creative management. They'd light two enormous fires side by side, then lead herds of cattle between them. It was a ritual of purification, though it also smelled suspiciously like barbecue. The idea was that the smoke would bless the livestock for the harsh winter ahead. The cattle, for their part, seemed unconvinced, and while the cows were getting spiritually fumigated, everyone else prepared offerings. Barley cakes, roasted meat, beer so thick it could legally qualify as porridge, all laid out for spirits, gods, and whoever else might be wandering by. Samhain wasn't about scaring ghosts away. It was about giving them snacks so they'd go haunt someone else. The druids, meanwhile, drifted through the smoke like ethereal project managers. Cloaked, hooded, and perpetually mysterious, they carried staffs carved with symbols that looked like they meant something, though no one ever dared ask. They chanted in languages already ancient, tossing herbs into the flames, predicting the weather, and occasionally pretending to understand it. Some say they could tell the future by reading the shapes in the smoke. Others think they were just buying time while the beer warmed up. And yes, there was beer. There is always beer. In fact, most historians agree that Samhain celebrations probably contained the perfect ratio of theology to intoxication. 1 part cosmic reverence, 3 parts you had to be there. Ale was safer than water and considerably more fun, which might explain why so many spirits were allegedly sighted after midnight. But not all spirits came from barrels. Some came from the dark beyond the firelight. People believed that during Samhain, the boundaries between worlds, human, divine and otherwise, had become dangerously porous. Invisible visitors drifted among the living, curious, maybe lonely, maybe hungry. They weren't always malicious, but they were unpredictable. Like neighbors, really, except you couldn't file a complaint. That's why the fires mattered so much. They were anchors, glowing beacons in a world suddenly unmoored. Each family would bring a torch home from the great communal blaze to rekindle their hearths. A ritual of protection and renewal. You didn't just take light home, you took order. The village's collective courage divided into hundreds of small flickering flames. In between these solemn acts, of course, there was chaos. Someone's cloak caught a spark. A child tried to toast an uncooperative root vegetable. A group of teenagers, yes, even Iron Age teenagers, sneaked away from the circle to carve rude symbols into the hillside or kiss behind a rock shaped suspiciously like a giant nose. The druids pretended not to notice. Every society has priorities, and maintaining the illusion of dignity was one of them. Still, beneath the ale, laughter, and questionable pyrotechnics, something deeper stirred. A kind of awe that slipped quietly through the cracks of human noise. The Celts didn't need science to sense their smallness in the grand scheme of things. The night sky above them was a cathedral of cold fire, stars flickering like the eyes of old gods. Every breath turned to mist. Every heartbeat echoed against the hills. It was humbling, and in its way, comforting. When you think about it, the entire ceremony was one long, whispered bargain with the universe. We'll light the fire, we'll sing the songs, we'll play nice with the ghosts. Just keep the sun coming back. No one said it outright, but everyone felt it. The fear of the dark wasn't childish, it was ecological. Too long a winter could mean famine. A bad storm could erase an entire village. So they laughed louder, danced harder, and poured another drink, not out of joy, but defiance. As the night deepened, the wind shifted. Smoke rolled over the hills, thick and fragrant with herbs, fat, and ash. The fires roared higher, fueled by old wood and new prayers. People threw handfuls of grain into the blaze. Small sacrifices, reminders of abundance and humility. You gave a little, hoping the gods would notice and not demand more. Then, near midnight, when the last song trailed off into yawns and embers, the druids declared the ritual complete. The fire was allowed to fade to a gentle red glow, like the heart of a sleeping beast. Families gathered their children and their courage and walked home beneath a sky that seemed wider now, emptier maybe, but less hostile. Each doorway they passed felt safer once a new spark burned inside it. Each tiny fire whispered, "You made it through another year." And out in the fields beyond the fences, unseen shapes moved through the fog. The ancestors, the forgotten, the curious, watching, perhaps smiling, at how the living still tried to keep the dark at bay with smoke, warmth, and beer. Because in the end, that's all Samhain ever was, humanity's most beautiful boundary issue. A night when the world didn't quite know where to draw the line, and decided, wisely, not to. If you've ever met someone who insists they can read your aura, predict the weather, and tell you which herbal tea will fix your soul, congratulations, you've basically met a druid. Except, these guys didn't just sell candles. They ran the entire spiritual and political Wi-Fi network of the Celtic world. To the people of ancient Ireland and Britain, druids were part priest, part doctor, part bard, and part mysterious neighbor, who always seemed to know when you were about to make a bad decision. They were the keepers of law, the whisperers of secrets, and the only ones who could get away with standing dramatically in fog without being asked if they were lost. No one really knows where druids came from, and they preferred it that way. They didn't write things down. Their entire education was oral. Imagine studying for 20 years just to memorize what your teacher said, and then realizing your final exam is never die or the syllabus disappears. But this secrecy gave them power. Knowledge was their smoke, dense, mysterious, impossible to bottle. And on Samhain night, that smoke became literal. As the villagers built the great bonfires, the druids moved among them like stage managers of reality. They carried bundles of herbs, mugwort, sage, yarrow, plants chosen not for their practicality, but for their theatrical smoke effects. Each handful tossed into the flames produced new colors, new scents, and new excuses for people to gasp reverently. It was history's first fog machine, and the special effects budget came straight from nature. The purpose of all this wasn't just aesthetic. Druids believed smoke was a bridge, a way for prayers to drift upward, for messages to travel to the unseen. You didn't just burn wood, you burned intention. Every rising curl was a wish, a memory, or a gentle complaint to whichever deity happened to be on duty. You could tell how desperate the prayers were by how much smoke filled the air. If you couldn't see your own hand, someone was definitely begging for a mild winter. Some accounts, mostly Roman gossip, claim that druids sacrificed animals, or worse, people. But Roman historians were notorious drama queens who saw a bonfire and assumed it contained at least 3 civilians. More likely, these rituals involved offerings of crops, milk, or small animals already destined for stew. The Celts valued symbolism over slaughter. The fire didn't need blood, it needed meaning. The druids themselves were performers of silence. They rarely shouted their spells. Instead, they chanted low and slow, a rhythm like breathing or waves or your own heartbeat when you're half asleep. They'd raise their hands, draw invisible circles in the air, and speak to gods with names so old that even the wind had to lean closer to listen. Imagine standing in that moment. The crowd quiet, the flames bending, the air thick with sweet herbal smoke. The druid's voice murmuring something you don't quite understand, yet it feels familiar, like remembering a dream you never had. You start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the smoke really is carrying something. Your hope, your fear, or that secret wish you didn't tell anyone. The line between magic and psychology was thin in those days. People needed ceremony as much as fire. Watching the druids perform gave structure to chaos. Proof that someone somewhere knew what to do when the world tilted toward darkness. In truth, the druids didn't control nature. They narrated it. They turned the randomness of life into a story you could survive. And isn't that what all storytellers do? Their influence reached beyond ritual. They were judges, mediators, teachers of kings. If two clans fought over land, the druids would show up, quote a few verses, and everyone would pretend to agree until they left. They understood that true power wasn't in swords or harvests. It was in persuasion. If you could convince someone the gods were on your side, you'd already won. Back at the fires, their assistants, apprentice druids, or as we might call them, interns, kept the smoke flowing, adding herbs at timed intervals. The villagers sighed contentedly, certain that the rising clouds carried away sickness, bad luck, and any embarrassing things they might have said to a spirit last year. Children tried to chase the smoke, waving their arms through it, giggling when it curled around their fingers like invisible ribbons. By midnight, the whole hillside was wrapped in a soft haze. The stars above shimmered faintly through it, turning the sky into a living tapestry of gold and grey. And in that quiet hour, the druids made their final gestures, blessings whispered into the fire's core, promises to guide the people through the long months ahead. They didn't shout, "The ritual is complete." They simply stepped back, letting the smoke fade, letting silence finish the prayer. When the fires finally burned low, the druids disappeared into the mist, as they always did, without farewell, without fanfare. By dawn, only their footprints remained in the damp grass, a few charred herbs beside the ashes, and that lingering scent of something sacred and slightly confusing. Centuries later, their smoke still drifts through history. Every candle lit on Halloween night, every wisp of incense, every puff of breath that carries a whispered wish. It all echoes those ancient ceremonies, because somewhere deep down, we still believe what the druids knew, that a little smoke, a little story, and a little faith can hold the darkness back, if only for one more night. By now, the fires had burned low. The druids had vanished back into the mist to do whatever mysterious paperwork druids did, and the villagers were left with a question that's haunted humanity ever since. What do you wear when the dead are coming over? Samhain wasn't just a night of flames and feasts. It was a night of appearances. The living had to blend in with the visiting spirits, because nobody wanted to stand out as the mortal with the nice warm body. So they disguised themselves, not for fun, not for Instagram, but for self-preservation. The first Halloween costumes weren't sexy, clever, or comfortable. They were made from whatever you could grab: animal hides, scraps of linen, and a generous amount of soot. If you happened to look terrifying, that was a bonus. If you looked ridiculous, that worked too. The point wasn't beauty, it was anonymity. On this one night, when the veil thinned and the invisible could see you, the goal was to make sure the invisible couldn't recognize you. Imagine it, a cold October wind sliding over the hills, the last orange embers glowing faintly in the grass. From the dark edges of the forest, people begin to emerge, wearing horns, bones, ragged cloaks, and expressions that say, "I hope this foolproof disguise works on spirits and neighbors alike." Children stumble under oversized masks carved from turnips. Yes, turnips, because pumpkins hadn't yet invaded Europe with their cheerful orange smugness. The smell of smoke and dirt clings to everyone, and somewhere, a dog is barking at what it's pretty sure is its owner wearing an upside-down sheep pelt. It was all part of a simple logic. If the dead couldn't tell who was who, they'd move on peacefully. This was a form of camouflage, spiritual stealth mode. Blend in with the ghosts, and maybe they won't drag you into the mist. Or worse, ask you for directions to the afterlife. The disguises also had a social function. They let people do things they normally couldn't. Behind a mask, the farmer could flirt with the chieftain's daughter, the baker could insult his neighbor's bread, and the local troublemaker could wander around pretending to be a banshee without legal consequence. For one night, identity was suspended. You weren't yourself anymore. You were something ancient and free, a shape in the dark with permission to misbehave. In a way, Samhain was the Celts' version of controlled chaos. They didn't repress fear, they danced with it. They didn't deny death, they invited it to dinner and asked for a story. The masks weren't meant to mock the supernatural. They were a truce, a quiet agreement that for a few hours, the living and the dead could share the same stage without anyone needing to explain themselves. Some villagers took it further. They'd smear ashes across their faces, wear the skulls of animals, or drape themselves in fur that still smelled faintly like its former owner. These weren't costumes so much as ritual armor. Every scrap of soot, bone, and wool said the same thing. I'm not afraid of the dark, but I'm also not taking any chances. In the flickering light of the fires, these disguises looked otherworldly. The smoke made everything shimmer, blurring the line between flesh and spirit. You might swear you saw a ghost passing by, but it was just your cousin Fergus, covered in mud and poor decisions. And that's the beauty of it. No one knew who was real and who wasn't. For one night, the village became a living ghost story, and everyone was the punchline. Over time, the act of dressing up evolved into its own kind of entertainment. Children were encouraged to join, partly because it kept them busy, and partly because ghosts, much like toddlers, were less likely to cause trouble if they were already involved. Some families even used the disguises to act out short plays or recite verses to the spirits, the ancient version of trick-or-treating, except the treat was usually bread, and the trick was not being cursed. And while nobody carved pumpkins yet, the Celts did carve lanterns out of, you guessed it, those same hard, lumpy turnips. They'd hollow them out, cut crude faces into the sides, and place a candle inside. The glowing turnip would be set by the doorway to scare away wandering souls. It worked beautifully, if your definition of beautifully includes deeply unsettling vegetable with 1,000-yard stare. Eventually, these customs spread, changed and softened. The disguises became playful rather than protective. Masks made of animal hide turned into masks made of paper, and the line between survival and celebration blurred. until no one remembered where it had started. But somewhere in every vampire costume, every plastic skeleton, and every pumpkin light glowing on a suburban porch, there's still a faint echo of those first Celtic nights, a whisper of fur, soot, and laughter beneath the stars. Samhain wasn't about fear. It was about acceptance. The understanding that the world was full of things you couldn't control, but you could still dance with them. And maybe, if you were lucky, they'd dance back. So the villagers kept their disguises on until dawn. When the sky began to lighten, they peeled off their masks, blinked into the soft grey morning, and smiled at one another like people waking from the same strange dream. They'd fooled the spirits, entertained the gods, and terrified the livestock, all in one night. Not bad for a civilization without Pinterest. And somewhere, in the lingering mist above those hills, a few amused ghosts drifted home, chuckling quietly to themselves, impressed that the living could look so ridiculous, and yet somehow so brave. By the time the smoke thinned and the singing faded, the village had one last task before winter truly began: bringing the cows home. Now, this might not sound like the stuff of spiritual revelation, but in Celtic life, cows were everything: milk, meat, money, and mild entertainment when nothing else was happening. They were the beating heart of the household economy, and Samhain was the night they came in from the summer pastures. It was less pastoral poetry and more chaotic relocation program. Imagine dozens of half-frozen villagers trying to herd suspicious animals through fog, mud, and the occasional overexcited druid shouting, "This way," while pointing in 3 directions at once. The air smelled like peat smoke, wet fur, and mild regret. Each family's cattle were driven between the 2 sacred bonfires, the same fires the druids had blessed earlier that evening. This wasn't just practical warmth, it was spiritual disinfection. The Celts believed the flames would purify the animals, driving out evil, disease, or any unwanted hitchhiking spirits that might have decided to attach themselves to a particularly handsome bull. The cows, for their part, looked unconvinced. They stood blinking at the firelight, lowing softly as sparks drifted toward the stars. Someone's calf panicked, broke free, and ran directly into a basket of grain offerings, officially making it the first recorded instance of sacrilege by cow. Children screamed, adults chased, the druids pretended it was symbolic, and eventually, everyone just called it a blessing in disguise. Still, beneath the noise and confusion, there was a rhythm to it all, the kind that only centuries of repetition can make. Samhain wasn't a single night of madness. It was a yearly ritual of order, a way of bringing life back under human control before the wildness of winter set in. Once the livestock was safely corralled, the gates were closed and the fires began to fade. Inside each enclosure, cows shifted restlessly, snorting clouds of steam into the cold air. The villagers gathered around them, patting their flanks, murmuring prayers for strong calves, warm milk, and a mild winter. It might sound sentimental now, but to the Celts, it was deadly serious. A bad season could mean starvation. A plague in the herds could wipe out a clan. So these little acts of tenderness, a whispered blessing, a pat on a shaggy neck, a bowl of milk left out for the spirits, were more than superstition. They were hope made tangible, and as the cattle settled in, the night itself seemed to exhale. The fires dimmed to embers. The children, exhausted from pretending to be ghosts and running from actual cows, were finally tucked into piles of wool and straw. Outside, the world was still, or as still as any world can be when it's full of spirits, smoke, and livestock noises. But peace never lasted long in a Celtic village, because Samhain wasn't just about closing the gates, it was also about opening them again. You see, in the old calendar, this night marked the turning of the year. The barriers between seasons, like those between worlds, grew soft and strange. So once the cows were safe and the fires banked, people performed a curious counter-ritual. They opened their doors just a little to let the spirits of their ancestors inside. It wasn't an invitation so much as a polite acknowledgement. A place was set at the table, a candle was lit by the hearth, and sometimes a cup of ale was left near the doorway for whoever passes. It was hospitality extended across time, a way of saying, "You're remembered, you still belong here." The living feasted. The dead, one imagines, hovered nearby, smelling the bread and ale, occasionally sighing because ghosts have famously poor table manners. Somewhere between the prayers and the snores, the wind picked up again, whispering through the thatched roofs and making the doors creak. And though everyone knew it was just the weather, a few villagers swore they heard voices, old voices, familiar ones, humming the same songs they'd sung that evening by the fire. The Celts didn't see this as frightening. Quite the opposite. It meant the ancestors had accepted their invitation, that the invisible guests had joined the feast and would, hopefully, help the living survive another year. By dawn, the fires had burned to ash. The cows lowed softly, impatient for breakfast. The spirits, satisfied, slipped back across the vale. The village yawned, stretched, and returned to the slow rhythm of survival. Somewhere in that gentle transition, between smoke and light, fear and laughter, lay the secret of Samhain's endurance. It wasn't just about death, or ghosts, or bonfires. It was about continuity. The reassurance that life, no matter how fragile, could be renewed with the right blend of reverence, ritual, and mild agricultural chaos. It's easy to romanticize it now, to picture serene Celts in moonlight, serenading cows while the ancestors look on approvingly. But it was messy, muddy, loud. Someone probably lost a shoe. Someone else definitely drank too much. And yet, amid all that imperfection, something transcendent happened. The community became one living organism, breathing, moving, surviving together through another turn of the year. As the morning mist lifted, a few sleepy villagers looked back at the smoking fire pits and smiled. Another Samhain complete. Another bargain made with the dark. Another year safely ushered home, cows included. And if the spirits were still lingering, unseen in the fields, watching their descendants shuffle back indoors, well, they probably nodded in approval. Because for all its smoke and shouting, its mud and mooing, Samhain worked. It made sure the living didn't forget the dead, and the dead didn't forget to be kind. And somewhere, in that warm, animal-scented air, the first faint thought of winter began to stir. Cold, slow, and patient, waiting for its turn. Once the cows were settled, the fires burned low, and the villagers had eaten their weight in questionable stew. Samhain slipped into its most mysterious phase, the night shift. The hour when the living got quiet, the wind got bold, and the dead got social. You see, for the Celts, the other world wasn't some faraway realm full of angels with harps or devils with paperwork. It was right there, layered over the mortal world like a second skin, invisible but occasionally glitching into view. And on Samhain night, the glitch went full screen. The boundary between the living and the dead, between the seen and unseen, became a sort of spectral open bar. It wasn't horror, it was networking. The ancestors came calling, not to scare the living, but to check in. Maybe share a few spectral life tips. Maybe see what had changed since they'd last haunted the place. Death, it turned out, had excellent attendance at the family reunions. Every household prepared for it in its own way. Some left food out on the doorstep, bowls of porridge, slices of bread, mugs of ale, so that hungry spirits could grab a bite before drifting onward. Others left candles in the window, gentle lanterns glowing like cosmic "you up?" messages to anyone wandering between worlds. If the offerings were gone by morning, people smiled knowingly. If they were untouched, people nodded solemnly and muttered, probably full from the neighbours. The Celts didn't think of their ancestors as gone, only elsewhere. The dead were still family, still part of the tribe. They just happened to have a slightly more flexible attendance policy. So when the veil thinned, the living didn't hide from them. They greeted them, sometimes nervously, often fondly, and always with food, because hospitality doesn't stop at mortality. Picture it, a smoky, candlelit cottage, the hearth crackling, a pot of something thick and comforting bubbling quietly. A family gathered around the fire, whispering stories of those who'd passed. Outside, the wind moves through the trees, the branches tapping softly on the roof. Not a threat, just a reminder. Somewhere in that sound, you imagine laughter, or maybe the faint echo of a familiar voice saying, "We're still here." It wasn't all sweet sentiment, of course. The Celts had a healthy respect for unpredictable guests. Not every spirit was kindly Aunt Bridget dropping by to compliment your bread making. Some were wanderers, lonely souls who hadn't yet found peace, still walking the hills and crossroads. Those needed appeasing too. Hence the offerings, the candles, the muttered prayers that basically translated to, "We respect you, but please don't rearrange the furniture." In a sense, this was the spiritual equivalent of leaving treats for trick-or-treaters. Thousands of years before the phrase existed. Give the ghosts what they want, and they'll move on peacefully. Forget, and they might remind you in unsettling ways. Milk curdled, doors creaked, or your best cow suddenly refused to be milked. The message was clear. Feed your dead, or they'll find a way to feed on your nerves. But the night wasn't grim. If anything, it was oddly heartwarming. The community shared a collective sense of being surrounded, not by menace, but by continuity. Life and death weren't opposites. They were neighbors borrowing sugar from each other. The dead weren't feared. They were remembered, woven into stories, laughter, and the soft clatter of dishes at the table. Even the air felt different, thicker, softer, alive with the quiet hum of presence. Dogs would stare into corners for too long. Candles flickered for no reason. And rather than panic, people would shrug and say, "They're here." The unseen was expected, even welcomed. Because if ghosts were visiting, it meant the world was still turning, still connected. The grand, eternal conversation between past and present continuing as usual. The druids claimed they could sense when a spirit entered the room. A drop in temperature, a flicker of smoke, a strange hush in the fire's crackle. But most ordinary folks didn't need mystical skills. They just felt it. That sudden stillness in the chest, the moment when the room seemed to hold its breath, as if time itself had paused to let someone else walk through. Sometimes people spoke aloud to the air, greeting old relatives, or asking for guidance, or just telling them the gossip they'd missed since last Samhain. "Your son finally built that fence," someone might murmur toward the corner. Still crooked, though. There was humour in it, soft human humour that made death less frightening and more familiar. And somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the reach of the fires, the other world shimmered, not a realm of punishment, but of peace. A mirror place where time bent gently, and the ancestors waited for the living to remember them again. It was said that if you listened closely enough on Samhain night, you could hear that place. Faint voices carried on the wind, laughter drifting through the mist, maybe even music. Not frightening, not mournful, just distant and beautiful. By dawn, the veil would close again, the connection fading like breath on a window pane. The food would be gone or cold, the candles burned low, and the living would yawn, stretch, and return to their ordinary worries. Crops, cows, gossip. But for a brief, shimmering night, they'd remembered that they weren't alone in the world. They were part of something vast and ongoing. A great, eternal dinner party when no one truly leaves. They just move to another table. And perhaps, if you're quiet enough tonight, listening to the hum of your own house, you'll feel it too. That soft, ancient network still buzzing faintly in the dark. Because every whisper of wind, every flicker of light, every creak in the floorboards just might be someone saying hello. By the time the spirits had been fed and the cows had stopped looking suspicious, the villagers of ancient Celtic Europe were finally free to do what humans have always done once they've survived their chores and their existential dread. They played games, because if you've just spent half the night appeasing ghosts, dodging druids, and wearing a dead animal as a disguise, what better way to relax than trying to catch fruit with your face? Welcome to Samhain Divination Night, also known as the origin story of every Halloween party game that has ever involved apples, water, or mild humiliation. The Celts believed Samhain wasn't just the end of the year, it was a hinge in time, a moment when fate itself loosened its grip. With the boundary between worlds dissolving, you could glimpse the future if you knew where to look. And where did they look? Into bowls of water. Because apparently, the other world didn't do mirrors yet. The most famous of these rituals was apple bobbing. Though back then, it wasn't about fun or friendly competition. It was a full contact spiritual activity with potential dental injury. A tub or wooden basin would be filled with water and apples, and eager young villagers would take turns trying to grab one with their teeth. No hands allowed, of course. It was believed that the first person to bite into an apple would be the next to marry, because nothing says lifelong commitment like nearly drowning in a bucket for fruit. And if you think that sounds odd, it gets better. Some people peeled apples in long, curling strips and threw the peels over their shoulders. When they landed, the twist of skin was said to form the first letter of your future spouse's name. Historians call this folk divination. Modern people might call it over-analyzing produce. There were other forms of Samhain fortune-telling too, all equally creative and mildly alarming. Some dropped hazelnuts into the fire, naming each one after a potential sweetheart. The nut that burned steadily symbolized true love. The one that popped loudly meant an explosive breakup ahead. It was the Iron Age version of reading text messages. Others baked special soul cakes, tiny loaves of bread or sweet dough marked with symbols, sometimes hiding a ring, a coin, or a thimble inside. Find the ring, and you'd marry soon. Find the coin, and you'd prosper. Find the thimble, and congratulations. You'd remain single forever, which, in fairness, might have been the most peaceful option. But it wasn't just about romance. The Celts used these small, silly rituals to seek answers about the coming year, about weather, harvest, luck, and life itself. Because deep down, every human wants the same thing, a preview of what's coming, even if it's written in apple juice and smoke. There was something tender about it too. After hours of honoring ancestors and fearing the dark, these little games reminded everyone that life continued, that laughter still mattered. In a world where the future was uncertain and the winters were brutal, even the silliest traditions had weight. A peel thrown over a shoulder, a nut dropped in a fire. They were gestures of hope, disguised as play. And maybe that's what made them powerful. You didn't need grand temples or golden idols. You needed faith, breath, and a kitchen bowl. When people laughed and gasped at the flames, or cheered as someone finally caught an apple between their teeth, they weren't mocking the gods. They were joining them in the game. Because maybe fate isn't something that happens to you. Maybe it's something you flirt with, one splash at a time. Archaeologists sometimes roll their eyes at this kind of folk magic, but that misses the point. These rituals were emotional technology, little ways to process uncertainty. If the year ahead held famine, at least you could say the apple peel had warned you. If love found you by spring, you could credit the hazelnut. And if nothing happened at all, well, you still got a snack. The air during these games was different, lighter. The fear that hung thick around the bonfires began to loosen. Music returned. Children laughed. Someone probably tried to cheat by using their hands and got publicly shamed for it. Someone else insisted their apple peel definitely looked like the letter B, even though everyone agreed it looked more like a question mark. It was messy, funny, human, the kind of noise that makes the darkness less intimidating. Outside, the spirits drifted quietly through the night, watching the living play and wondering what it felt like to laugh again. Perhaps they smiled, or whatever the ghostly equivalent of smiling is, and followed the sound of splashing and shouting like moths to firelight. Maybe they too believed that games could bridge worlds, because that's what Samhain was about. Not endings, but connection. Between past and future, living and dead, fear and joy. Every act, from lighting fires to dunking for apples, was part of the same conversation. We're here. You're there. Let's pretend the line between us doesn't exist for one night. By the time the stars began to fade and the first blush of dawn crept over the hills, the apple water had turned murky, the laughter had softened, and the fires burned low again. The games were over, but the wish lingered. A quiet promise whispered into the smoky morning air that life, like an apple, would float back to the surface no matter how deep it was pushed down. By the time the last apple had been fished from the tub, and everyone had stopped accusing each other of cheating, the air outside had changed. The laughter faded, the warmth of the fires thinned, and beyond the ring of light, something else was moving. Not ghosts, not druids. Something older, smaller, and considerably worse at minding its own business. The Owl Sea. Now, if you're picturing cheerful fairies with glitter and wands, put that thought away immediately. The Celtic fair folk were not the kind of creatures who granted wishes or helped lost children find their way home. These were the ancient spirits of the mounds, beings so unpredictable that even the dead treated them cautiously. The Owl Sea were nature's middle management. Not quite gods, not quite ghosts, but entities who had opinions about everything, especially humans. They lived in the hollow hills, under ancient barrows and burial mounds, in worlds parallel to ours. Their homes were said to glow softly at night, the light flickering like lanterns beneath the earth. And on Samhain, when the veil thinned, those doors sometimes opened. No one wanted to be nearby when they did. Old stories warned that the fair folk liked to travel on Samhain night, gliding silently through the mist, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. They might bless your crops, or steal your best cow. They might bring you fortune, or drag you halfway into the underworld because you forgot to leave out cream. You never knew which mood they were in, and you absolutely did not want to find out firsthand. So people took precautions. Bowls of milk or cream were left on the doorstep, a peace offering, a kind of "please don't ruin my year" tax. Bread was broken and left by the window. No one dared spill water after dark, in case a fairy happened to be passing and took offense at the splash. And whatever you did, you didn't speak their name out loud. Even saying fairy was considered rude. The polite term was the good people or the gentle folk, because apparently passive-aggressive flattery worked even on supernatural entities. There were tales whispered around fires of people who forgot these rules. One man, there's always one, boasted that he didn't believe in such nonsense and ploughed too close to a fairy mound. That night, his oxen vanished, his crops rotted, and his beard turned white before morning. Another story told of a woman who peeked through her window on Samhain night and saw a column of lights winding across the fields like a procession of stars walking the earth. She watched, transfixed, until one of the lights turned toward her, and she woke up 3 days later, blind in one eye and missing her shadow. No one could prove these stories, of course, but nobody wanted to test them either. It was easier and wiser to assume that the Aussie were always listening. The fair folk weren't entirely cruel, though. Some legends said they helped the deserving. They'd lead lost travelers home with glowing lights or slip gold coins under a doorstep for those who showed respect. But even their kindness came at a price. Take a gift from them, and you might owe them something later. Maybe a favor, maybe a decade of your life, maybe your ability to stop humming their music at inconvenient times. Their world was said to mirror ours, but better. Greener fields, brighter stars, sweeter food, and no taxes. It sounded lovely until you realized that time worked differently there. Spend one night dancing in the fairy mounds, and when you stumbled home, 100 years might have passed. People learned that lesson quickly, though a few folk heroes still disappeared into the hills, leaving behind nothing but footprints and vague promises to write. So, on Samhain night, doors were bolted early, fires were kept burning low but steady, light to keep human warmth near, shadows to keep fairy eyes away. If you had to go out after dark, you turned your coat inside out to confuse them. You avoided crossroads and burial mounds, and most importantly, you never accepted strange food from a stranger, no matter how polite they seemed or how good the pastries looked. Because fairies, much like distant relatives, could not be trusted when they showed up uninvited and bearing snacks. Yet for all their mischief, the fair folk gave Samhain its tension. That shimmering sense that the world wasn't just fields and stone, but something alive, watching, listening. The Celts didn't divide the world into real and supernatural. For them, it was all part of the same landscape, seen and unseen, coexisting like layers of mist. And maybe that's why the night felt so sacred, because while the ghosts were family, the fair folk were a reminder of mystery, the wild, unexplainable parts of existence that refused to behave or be fully understood. They were nature's way of saying, you don't control everything. You never did. By dawn, when the sun finally pushed through the fog, the hills looked normal again. Silent, grassy, innocent. But the offerings left on doorsteps were gone. The bowls licked clean. The bread reduced to crumbs. No one spoke of it directly, but as people stretched and blinked in the pale light, they shared quiet, knowing looks. Relief that they'd survived another visit from the unseen. And somewhere beneath the green mounds, in halls made of light and air, the fair folk feasted, smiling their sharp, perfect smiles, toasting the mortals above who still remembered to be polite. Because respect, after all, was the oldest magic of all. By this point in the night, the bonfires were dim, the milk bowls empty, and the fair folk had hopefully retreated back into their hills, counting their lactose blessings. The villagers, still wide-eyed from the flicker of flames and folklore, began to wander home, each holding a single torch, each pretending the darkness didn't breathe quite so close. But as any Celt could have told you, not every monster came from the underworld. Some came from the next cottage over. Samhain wasn't just about the spirits beyond the veil. It was also the one night a year when everyone quietly admitted that evil and comedy could start very locally. Ghosts were scary, yes, but have you ever tried sharing a fence with a neighbor who thinks your chickens are stealing his luck? The Iron Age was full of superstition and strong opinions, both of which fermented quickly in the absence of daylight. By Samhain, after months of gossip and ale, the air was thick with suspicions. Old grudges peeked out like weeds through frost. The same people who sang together at dusk might, by midnight, be whispering that so-and-so's daughter was a shapeshifter because she didn't blink enough. It started small. Someone's bread didn't rise. Someone else's cow gave sour milk. Clearly, this wasn't weather or chance. It was interference. And since the dead were wandering anyway, why not blame them? Or better yet, blame that one woman who lived near the bog and talked to herbs like they were co-workers. In a society without street lights or science, rumors spread faster than fire through dry straw. If your shadow looked too long in the moonlight, someone might call you cursed. If your eyes gleamed oddly by the fire, people muttered about second sight. And if you happened to own a black cat, well, congratulations. You just became an educational example in next year's cautionary tale. But here's the thing. Most of these monsters weren't malevolent. They were simply different. Healers, herbalists, lonely widows, travelers from another tribe. People who didn't fit neatly into the comfortable rhythm of farm, family, and field. Samhain, with its thin walls and heightened senses, made everyone notice difference, and then fear it. The darkness outside had always been manageable. It was the darkness inside the human mind that caused the real trouble. Yet even this fear had a strange usefulness. Pointing at a monster gave the rest of the village a sense of order. It explained bad luck. It united everyone against a shared, preferably local problem. Because nothing brings people together quite like accusing your neighbor of mild witchcraft. Still, there were moments when even the skeptics wondered if the whispers were right. A goat's eyes glinting red in the torchlight. A gust of wind that slammed a door without warning. A child waking suddenly, claiming a pale woman had been singing outside the window. The rational mind said coincidence. The Celtic mind said something wants attention. To keep balance, villagers performed small protective rituals that doubled as public therapy. A sprig of rowan hung over the doorway. Salt sprinkled across thresholds. A quick spit into the fire to confuse lurking spirits, because apparently Ghosts had short attention spans. Each act whispered the same message. We see the darkness and we're politely declining it. And perhaps, deep down, everyone knew that the real threat wasn't a fairy thief or a hungry ghost. It was envy, hunger, grief, the invisible forces that lived inside ordinary people. Samhain just gave those feelings a costume, a name, a place to go for the night. Once you'd blamed a banshee for your anxiety, you could sleep again. And maybe that was the point all along. So the villagers told stories around the embers, tales of shapeshifters who stole faces, of werewolves who forgot their manners, of spectral horsemen who collected debts no one remembered owing. The stories were half warning, half entertainment, and wholly communal. You listened, nodded solemnly, and tried not to glance at the person beside you who fit the description a little too well. When dawn finally began to smear grey over the hills, the world looked innocent again. The neighbours smiled, a bit awkwardly, as if they hadn't just accused one another of nocturnal transformations. Chickens were fed, cows milked, and gossip quietly shelved until next year. The monsters, real or imagined, went back to sleep, some in the ground, some in people's hearts. And the villagers, satisfied that balance had been restored, went about the gentle business of pretending nothing strange had ever happened. Because that was Samhain's final trick. It reminded everyone that the line between them and us, monster and neighbour, was only as thick as the morning mist. And by the time the sun rose high enough to burn it away, the villagers had already forgiven each other, mostly. After all, it was easier to stay friends when you could blame the fairies for everything you said after dark. By morning, the fields were quiet again. Smoke rising from the remains of bonfires, sheep blinking suspiciously at the human race, and the faint scent of burned herbs still clinging to everything. But out beyond the villages, on the lonely hills and mist-swallowed plains, the real mysteries of Samhain waited. Massive stone circles, standing monoliths, silent alignments of rock that had been watching humanity stumble through its superstitions for thousands of years. If you've ever stood inside one of those circles, say Newgrange or Stonehenge, or one of their lesser-known siblings that never made it onto a postcard, you know the feeling. The air changes. It doesn't move so much as listen. Every sound you make comes back slower, deeper, like the world is thinking about it before replying. And it's that echo, that sense of being gently eavesdropped on by time, that the Celts must have felt on nights like this. To them, these ancient stones weren't just landmarks, they were cosmic clocks. Calendars carved into the earth long before the word calendar existed, and Samhain, more than any other night, was their reset button. At places like Newgrange in Ireland, the architecture itself becomes the ritual. Archaeologists have found that on the mornings around the winter solstice, just weeks after Samhain, the first rays of sunlight pierce the entrance tunnel and flood the inner chamber with light. It lasts only a few minutes, but imagine living in a world without electricity, where dawn meant survival, and seeing that beam return after months of darkness. It wasn't a coincidence. It was proof that the gods still remembered the schedule. Even in earlier times, before druids had perfected their mysterious PR skills, people must have gathered around those stones, shivering, waiting for some cosmic confirmation that life would keep going. You can almost hear it, the wind cutting between the monoliths, the crackle of torches, the low murmur of prayers, half spoken and half hoped. Someone watching the horizon and whispering, any minute now. And then light, thin, golden, trembling, sliding across the frost-bitten grass like an apology for the long wait. Of course, not everyone agreed on what the light meant. To the druids, it was order, the pattern behind chaos. To the farmers, it was reassurance that their stored grain hadn't been hoarded in vain. To the children, it was probably just bright and mildly disappointing. But for everyone, it was connection. The certainty that even the coldest night couldn't last forever. That was the secret purpose of the stone circles. They turned time itself into ritual. The Celts didn't just mark the seasons, they performed them. Every fire, every offering, every song hummed into the dark wasn't about commanding nature. It was about syncing with it, aligning human rhythm to cosmic rhythm, heartbeat to horizon. It was science, theatre, and prayer, all rolled into one grand performance, repeated every year until the audience learned the lines by heart. And there's another layer to this ancient geometry. Some of those stones line up not just with the sun, but with the stars, the Pleiades, Orion, and others that would have been bright beacons in a pre-electric sky. Samhain, conveniently, falls right around the time the Pleiades reach their highest point in the heavens. So when the villagers looked up that night, they saw what their ancestors had seen for millennia. 7 cold diamonds glittering above the fires, whispering that time is a circle, not a line. Of course, it's easy now to imagine all this with a sort of romantic glow. Druids in perfect formation, stars exactly aligned, everyone humming in cosmic harmony. The truth was probably muddier. Someone forgot which stone was supposed to point where. Someone else tripped over an altar rock and blamed fairies. But even chaos has poetry. Even imperfection can feel sacred when the sky cooperates. Standing stones have long memories. They've watched languages die, faiths change, and people reinvent the same old fears in new packaging. And yet, when you walk among them at dusk, there's still that same quiet, a kind of hush that feels less like silence and more like a question. The same one the Celts asked on every Samhain. Will the light return? It always did. And maybe that was the whole point. Not the answer, but the asking. Because to build a calendar out of stone is to admit that you care enough to wait, to hope, to measure the world not in minutes, but in miracles. So as the first true chill of winter crept across the land, the villagers looked once more to the stones on the hills, massive silhouettes against a purple sky. They didn't need to understand them. It was enough to know that the stones were still there, still facing the sunrise, still holding the memory of every year that had come before. The fires would die, the food would run low, but the stones would stand. And as long as they did, the shells believed, so would the promise that the sun would find its way back again. For centuries, the Celts had danced with their ghosts, lit their bonfires, and bobbed for apples in peace. Then, sometime around the 1st century BCE, a new guest arrived on the fog-soaked shores of Britain. And, as history has proven time and again, new guests rarely bring casseroles. The Romans had come. Shiny helmets, polished sandals, a foreign language that sounded like an argument between marble statues. They weren't here for the scenery. They were here for empire. And when empire arrives, it doesn't usually RSVP. To the Celts, the Romans must have looked like aliens, marching in neat squares, carrying eagles on sticks, talking about plumbing and taxes, as if those were exciting concepts. They built straight roads through landscapes that had always curved and flowing baths in lands where most people still considered rain an adequate hygiene plan. At first, the Romans didn't care much about Samhain. they had their own festivals to worry about, particularly one dedicated to Pomona, the goddess of fruit, gardens, and anything that could be carved without summoning the dead. Pomona's symbol was, of course, the apple, which makes you wonder if the Celts and the Romans ever looked at each other's parties and thought, wait, are we doing the same thing? In typical Roman fashion, the conquerors didn't ban the local customs. They absorbed them like cultural sponges dipped in wine. Samhain didn't disappear. It evolved, blending Celtic fears with Roman flair. The result was something halfway between a harvest festival and a bureaucratic nightmare. Roman priests looked at the bonfires and thought, cute, but where's the marble? They saw the druids chanting in the mist and muttered, could use more paperwork. Soon enough, temples replaced hilltop fires. Animal sacrifices were scheduled rather than spontaneous, and people began to measure their superstition in proper Latin. But beneath the polished surface, the old rhythm survived. While Roman citizens toasted Pomona with wine, the locals still left milk for the spirits. While soldiers carved apples into elaborate offerings, Celtic children still wore soot masks to confuse the dead. The two worlds overlapped like layers of tracing paper. One neat and official, the other smoky and untamed. It must have been strange, living between calendars. On one side, the Roman year marched along in months, named after emperors. On the other, the Celtic wheel of seasons kept turning, Samhain to Imbolc to Beltane and back again. The Romans brought their roads, the Celts brought their bonfires. Together, they built a civilization that somehow smelled like incense and wet wool at the same time. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the cultural exchange. The druids, who'd spent centuries being the spiritual influencers of the Celtic world, suddenly found themselves out-chanted. The Romans didn't appreciate anyone who could inspire a crowd without official permission. So, in true empire fashion, they outlawed druidic practices and called it progress. Bonfires became unsanctioned gatherings. Smoke rituals were unregulated emissions, and the druids themselves were politely informed that their job description now fell under mythology. Still, ideas are slippery things. Even as Rome conquered the land quietly conquered Rome. The Celts' deep reverence for cycles and seasons began to seep into the invaders' routines. Soldiers, stationed at lonely outposts, lit small fires in winter and muttered local blessings they pretended not to believe in. Farmers adopted the habit of leaving a little bread for the spirits, just in case. And somewhere, a Roman general's wife probably asked her servants to hang rowan over the door, because the neighbors do it and their goats haven't died yet. Over time, Samhain and Pomona's festival began to merge. The Romans introduced apples and nuts to the Celtic feasts, adding a touch of sweetness to the smoke and beer aesthetic of the old rituals. If you've ever wondered why apples still dominate Halloween, that's why. It's the one Roman import that survived the fall of the empire. That, and plumbing envy. The blend of traditions created something unique. A festival that celebrated both life and decay, harvest and haunting. The Celts offered prayers to the dead. The Romans toasted the fruits of the living. Between them, they crafted a celebration of the in-between, that delicate twilight where everything overlaps. Gods and ghosts, light and dark, Latin and Gaelic. Of course, nobody wrote this down at the time. The Romans were busy cataloguing victories, and the Celts were too busy staying alive. But if you could have stood there, on a hilltop in Britain around the 1st century CE, you might have seen a strange, beautiful sight. A Roman soldier holding an apple in one hand and a torch in the other, watching a local woman throw grain into a fire for luck. Two worlds, one moment, both pretending they weren't copying each other's homework. As the centuries rolled on, the empire faded, the druids vanished, and the world shifted again. But the rituals, the light, the fire, the food left for unseen guests, lingered, stubborn and timeless. Because Rome might have built the roads, but Samhain built the map in people's hearts, the route between fear and wonder, between the living and the dead. And for the record, there were still no pumpkins. That particular orange invasion was centuries away. For now, the Celts carved their grimacing turnips, the Romans polished their apples, and everyone agreed that the best way to face the darkness was with something round, edible, and slightly ridiculous. Every festival eventually gets rebranded. One century, you're dancing around bonfires for the dead. The next, you're lighting candles for the saints. And somewhere in between, a few very tired priests are quietly wondering how to turn a pagan ghost party into something more suitable for Sunday school. That, in essence, is how Samhain became All Hallows' Eve, the Church's greatest and most reluctant remix. When Christianity spread through Europe, it found itself surrounded by the echoes of older faiths. You couldn't walk 5 miles without tripping over a sacred well, a fairy mound, or a perfectly good oak tree that someone was already worshipping. The early missionaries realized that banning these customs didn't work. People just did them quietly, which is arguably more powerful. So they tried a different tactic: absorption through sanctification. If you can't delete a festival, rename it. If you can't stop people from lighting fires, tell them they're doing it for the saints now. And that's exactly what happened. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III officially moved the Feast of All Saints' Day, a celebration of every holy person too obscure for their own holiday, to November 1st. It was a genius move. By placing it right after Samhain, the Church neatly overlaid holiness onto haunting. The living could pray for the souls of the righteous by day and politely ignore the ghosts that still dropped by at night. Soon, October 31st, the eve before All Saints, became All Hallows' Evening. Or, as language gradually dozed off and simplified it, Halloween. But here's the thing: you can bless the name, you can move the date, you can even build a church on top of a druidic site, and people will still keep leaving milk out for spirits. The old ways didn't vanish. They just learned new choreography. In villages across Ireland, Scotland and Wales, people dutifully attended Mass, then went home to light candles in windows for the wandering dead. They prayed for the saints. And then, just to be safe, they whispered a few extra words for their ancestors too. Faith, after all, is rarely monogamous. The Church found itself managing a delicate balancing act. On paper, the festival was about divine souls and heavenly order. In practice, it was still about bonfires, bread, and making sure no ghost felt left out. Even the clergy weren't immune. Some parish priests joined in the festivities, reasoning that if the villagers were going to dance around fires anyway, it might as well be under ecclesiastical supervision. The theology became wonderfully confused. Sermons about salvation blurred into stories about revenants. Prayers mingled with superstition. And for a few centuries, Europe existed in a sort of holy grey area, where saints and spirits shared the same calendar, and everyone politely pretended it made sense. Of course, with the saints came souls. And with souls came yet another night. All Souls' Day on November the 2nd. That one was for the ordinary dead, the ones not yet saintly, but hopefully trending in that direction. People baked soul cakes, small round pastries marked with crosses, and gave them to the poor in exchange for prayers for their deceased loved ones. Each cake eaten meant one soul lifted closer to heaven. It was theology via pastry, and it worked surprisingly well. Children and beggars went door to door singing songs for these cakes, blessing households as they went. It was pious, sweet, and, if you squint, suspiciously similar to modern trick-or-treating. Except instead of candy, you got a dry, slightly burnt carbohydrate and the moral satisfaction of having done your bit for the dead. But underneath the hymns and holy days, the old heartbeat of Samhain still pulsed. People still believed the veil was thin. They still lit fires, carved faces into vegetables, and swapped stories about the dead wandering the earth. They just added a few saints into the mix for better branding. By the Middle Ages, Halloween had become a theological patchwork, half heaven, half harvest, held together with candle wax and wishful thinking. In one corner of Europe, monks chanted solemn prayers for departed souls. In another, children played apple games by torchlight. And somehow, it all worked. Faith and folklore hand in hand, keeping each other company through the long, cold nights. Because despite the church's best intentions, the people never really gave up on their ghosts. They just gave them better manners. The dead no longer howled through the wind. They knocked politely. They no longer demanded offerings. They were given prayers. And the villagers, perhaps without realizing it, had turned fear into ritual and ritual into comfort. That's the strange, beautiful irony of history. Civilization keeps trying to tidy up the messy parts of human nature. The fear of death, the need for mystery, the longing to connect with what's gone. And yet, no matter how neatly we sweep, those old shadows keep curling back in through the cracks. So as church bells rang and candles flickered in every window, the people of Europe, saintly and sinful alike, did what they'd always done. They waited for night to fall. They whispered the names of their dead. They prayed, they laughed, they shared food, and somewhere between the hymns and the hearth fires, the veil stirred once more. Because whether you call it Samhain or All Hallows' Eve, the truth remained the same. The dead never really left. They just learned how to attend Mass. By the time the saints had settled in and the spirits had learned to keep their elbows off the table, something remarkable had happened. Samhain had survived again. It just had a new outfit, a cleaner name, a slightly better PR team. The church might have called it All Hallows' Eve, but underneath the polished Latin title, the old bones of the festival were still creaking merrily away. The fires still burned, the ghosts still wandered, and humanity still clung to the same ancient truth. We're afraid of the dark, but we also love an excuse to stay up late and talk about it. Medieval Europe, for all its saints and sermons, was a place that never quite learned to separate faith from folklore. And honestly, it was better that way. By the 13th century, All Hallows' Eve had become a beautifully confused hybrid, half holy day, half haunted party. You might spend the morning at church, confessing your sins, and the evening outdoors, wearing a turnip on your head and scaring your neighbors. Balance in its purest form. The church tolerated it, mostly, because it worked. People prayed harder when they were reminded that ghosts might be eavesdropping. The dead were no longer fearsome enemies, but politely invited guests. And the clergy, perhaps secretly relieved to see everyone in such good spirits, both kinds, learned to bless the chaos rather than fight it. It was during this strange in-between era that All Hallows' Eve picked up its final form, a night of contradiction, a night that was solemn and silly, sacred and slightly tipsy, where bells rang for lost souls and someone inevitably fell into a mud puddle dressed as an angel. If you'd wandered through a medieval village on October 31st, you'd have seen it all unfolding. Candles glowing in every window. Children walking from house to house with lanterns carved from turnips, their crooked faces grinning in the dark. People whispering prayers for the dead, then swapping ghost stories right afterward. Because why waste a perfectly good chill down the spine? And there was noise. So much noise. The tolling of church bells to remind everyone to pray for the souls in purgatory. The crackle of bonfires outside the town walls, their orange light dancing on the stone. Laughter, footsteps, a faint breeze carrying the smell of smoke and baking bread. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, not in fear, but in rhythm with something much older. The villagers called it Halloween. Hallows evening, shortened by lazy tongues and long nights. Over time, the word lost its holiness, but kept its melody. Halloween, a name that hums softly even now, like the echo of a candle flame. Of course, the meaning of the night kept shifting. For some, it was a time of remembrance. For others, a chance to test fate. Young women still played apple games to see who they'd marry. Old men told stories that blurred into warnings, and everyone, deep down, felt that quiet tingle. The awareness that the world was thinner than usual, that something unseen might be listening just beyond the dark. Even the masks lingered. What had once been disguises to fool the dead became part of the fun. Children and adults alike dressed up as spirits, devils, or saints, sometimes all at once, in case they needed to switch allegiances halfway through the night. The church tried to give it meaning, dress as a saint to honor their example. The villagers nodded politely and continued dressing as skeletons because, frankly, it was more relatable. Slowly, the holiday began to travel. Sailors carried the customs to new ports. Monks copied down the prayers. Traders brought tales of glowing turnips and flickering fires. And everywhere it went, Halloween absorbed a little of its surroundings. New songs, new foods, new superstitions, yet somehow stayed itself. Like a ghost learning a new language, but keeping the same voice. By the late Middle Ages, All Hallows' Eve had fully embedded itself in the European psyche, the one night a year when everyone, from kings to farmers, agreed on something. That death was worth acknowledging, but also worth laughing at. It was a delicate balance, a truce between dread and delight. The veil was thin, yes, but so was the line between terror and joy. And maybe that's why the rebrand worked, because even when the church tried to sanctify the festival, it couldn't erase its heartbeat. Samhain had never really been about fear. It was about connection to the earth, the ancestors, the stars, and the stories we tell to make sense of them all. Rename it, translate it, wrap it in robes or hymns. The meaning would still glow through, like fire through fog, like candlelight through a carved turnip. So as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, Halloween stayed put, patiently waiting for its next transformation. One that would take it across oceans and into the heart of an entirely new world. But that's a story for later. For now, the fires fade, the bells toll once more, and the villagers of medieval Europe drift home through quiet lanes. Their lanterns flicker, their shadows stretch, and in the still air between worlds, the ghosts follow gently behind. Not to haunt, not to harm, but simply to walk with them a little while longer. Because rebrand or not, the night still belonged to both sides of the veil, and neither was quite ready to let go. By the late Middle Ages, All Hallows' Eve had become a strange kind of duet, half prayer, half prank. The church provided the hymns, the villagers provided the mischief. And somewhere in the candlelit middle, the holiday began to smile for the first time. Halloween was changing. It was still about the dead, yes, but the tone had shifted from solemn respect to something closer to affectionate teasing. The fear that once sent people running into the dark now made them laugh. It was as though humanity had looked its oldest nightmare in the eye and said, "You know what? Let's make this fun." That transformation began with masks. At first, they were still meant as disguises, to confuse spirits, to blend in with the wandering dead. But slowly, the meaning flipped. Instead of hiding from fear, people began wearing it. They painted their faces white like bones, cut eyes into scraps of cloth, carved grinning expressions into turnips. The monster became the mask, and the mask became liberation. Behind those crude disguises, something delightful happened. People felt free. The social rules that normally wrapped the world in tight little knots loosened for one night. The farmer could play the ghost of a king. The baker's wife could pretend to be a banshee. Children ran wild through the streets with painted faces and sticks for swords, terrifying no one but each other. Fear had turned theatrical. Still spooky, but safely so. It was no longer about keeping evil away. It was about borrowing its costume for an evening. And in a society full of rules, superstition, and hierarchy, that was revolutionary. The earliest medieval masks were simple: soot, ash, rags, maybe a feather or two if you were feeling glamorous. But as centuries rolled on, the masks grew fancier, funnier, and far less serious. By the Renaissance, the festival looked almost playful. Parades, music, people dancing in skull makeup, while church bells rang politely in the distance, as if trying to remind everyone this was still technically about saints. Spoiler, it wasn't anymore. By then, the holiday had evolved into a kind of cultural pressure valve, a place for fear to go when it needed to stretch its legs. After all, people in medieval Europe lived with constant reminders of mortality. Plagues, wars, bad winters, questionable meat. They didn't need horror stories. Life was one. So Halloween became the one night when death was allowed to be entertaining instead of inevitable. That's where the makeup came in. At some point, villagers stopped just hiding behind masks and began painting faces directly. White for ghosts, black for shadows, red for demons, and occasionally green for "I ran out of soot." The artistry was simple, but the meaning was profound. To decorate your own fear was to own it. You could laugh at it, dance with it, and then wash it off in the morning. In some towns, this playful spirit became organized chaos. Groups of young people would roam from house to house performing short skits or songs in exchange for food or drink, a practice known as mumming or guising. If the performance pleased the household, they were rewarded. If not, there might be a prank, harmless mostly. A swapped gate, a missing chicken, or a mysterious pile of turnips arranged to spell out something vaguely insulting. It was society's way of saying, we all need to blow off steam, and we'll do it politely until someone's cartwheel goes missing. But at its core, the laughter was an act of courage. Every costume, every joke, every silly disguise was a reminder that fear only wins when it's taken too seriously. By mocking it, the people reclaimed power. Halloween had become the world's first group therapy session for mortality, and everyone was invited. Even the church, despite periodic grumbling, learned to look the other way. Better a happy sinner than a terrified one. And besides, every prankster still showed up at Mass the next morning, hungover but forgiven. There was beauty in the balance. Bonfires still burned, symbolizing the eternal cycle of light and darkness. Children still carried lanterns to guide lost souls. But now those lanterns flickered beside laughter, songs, and the occasional badly carved vegetable that looked less like a demon and more like a disappointed potato. The holiday had survived countless transformations, Celtic, Roman, Christian, yet its spirit stayed the same. Face the Kiam, darkness, light a fire, and remember to laugh. It's strange how constant that impulse remains. Even now, centuries later, when we smear fake blood on our faces or drape ourselves in skeleton costumes, we're repeating that same ancient ritual, mocking fear by wearing its face. We don't ward off the dark anymore. We invite it to the party. And when the candles burn low and the masks are set aside, there's something profoundly human in the silence that follows. A small, shared relief. We've looked at death again, just for a moment. And we've lived to tell the joke. Long before fun-sized chocolate bars and plastic pumpkins, there was a quieter, crumblier version of Halloween night. One that smelled not of sugar, but of yeast. Because in the Middle Ages, when people wanted to sweeten their relationship with the dead, they didn't hand out candy. They handed out bread. It was called souling. And if that word sounds both spiritual and slightly carbohydrate-based, that's because it was. Picture it. The year is somewhere around 1400. The wind has teeth, the candles sputter in narrow windows, and the church bells toll a slow rhythm that says, yes, death is real, but please come donate. Families gather by their hearths, the smell of wood smoke and barley thick in the air. Outside, small groups shuffle from door to door, not children in costumes, but the poor, the pious, and the opportunistic. They carry lanterns carved from turnips, the light flickering through crude faces, and they sing as they walk. Soul, soul for a soul cake, pray you good mistress, a soul cake. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, and 3 for him that made us all. It's half prayer, half jingle. Each verse promises heavenly benefits in exchange for baked goods. The logic was simple. If you couldn't personally spend hours praying for your dead relatives, you could outsource it. Give a cake to a souler, and they'd say a prayer for your family's dearly departed. A medieval version of paper pray. The cakes themselves were small and round, marked with a cross and spiced with nutmeg, cinnamon, and occasionally raisins if someone in the household had been unusually moral that year. They weren't treats so much as edible theology, but on a cold night with nothing but turnip soup to look forward to, a sweet, blessed biscuit sounded divine. Over time, souling evolved into a kind of communal theatre. The door-to-door visitors would bless houses, tell stories, or perform short mimes about mortality. Equal parts sermon and slapstick. And if the homeowner was stingy or rude, well, then came the trick. A rude rhyme. A handful of ash tossed at the door. A missing gate hinge that mysteriously appeared on the church roof the next morning. Harmless, mostly, but enough to keep the local bakers busy. It's here, in these muddy medieval streets, that the earliest seeds of trick-or-treating were sown. Not with candy, but with cakes. Not with superheroes and witches, but with villagers wrapped in cloaks that smelled faintly of smoke and theology. And it wasn't just the poor doing the rounds. Children soon joined in. because children always do when food is involved. They'd wander in groups, giggling between houses, repeating the songs they'd heard from the adults. Some wore masks to represent wandering souls. Others just enjoyed the excuse to stay up past bedtime. For one night, they were part of something ancient and slightly mischievous, a tradition that made the dead feel closer and the living feel braver. The church approved mostly. Praying for souls was encouraged. Minor vandalism, less so. But officials learned to tolerate the chaos. It was better than the alternative. People going back to lighting bonfires for pagan gods. And if a few fences went missing in the process, well, that was between the homeowner and St. Peter. Meanwhile, the music grew livelier. In some towns, fiddlers joined the processions. In others, bell ringers stayed up all night tolling the church bells to drive away the devils. There's a certain poetry in that, the clang of iron against fear, echoing over damp fields where villagers once sang to ghosts. You can almost hear it now. The hum of voices, the steady beat of boots on cobblestone, laughter carried on cold wind. And though few realized it, something profound was happening. The act of begging for soul cakes was slowly transforming from religious duty into social glue. It bridged classes. The rich gave, the poor prayed. The living remembered the dead, and the dead, one hoped, looked down approvingly, perhaps a little jealous that they couldn't eat. By dawn, the songs faded, the lanterns dimmed, and crumbs of cake lay scattered like offerings. The villagers went home with full stomachs and slightly emptier sins. The world felt balanced again. Centuries later, when immigrants carried these customs to America, the cakes would become candies, the prayers would become jokes, and the ash tossing would become harmless pranks. But the shape of the ritual, the exchange, the laughter, the shared performance, remained the same, because every culture finds a way to make peace with the dark. Sometimes you burn fires, sometimes you bake cookies, and sometimes you knock on your neighbor's door wearing something ridiculous and ask for sugar. It's all the same message, whispered down the ages in rhyme and pastry crumbs. Remember us. Feed us. Don't take life too seriously. And if you can, make it rhyme. So next time you open the door to a horde of small ghosts demanding candy, remember you're part of a chain that stretches back 600 years to a cold night, a warm hearth, and a song sung by lantern light for a slice of bread and a prayer. By the time the Middle Ages stumbled into the Renaissance, muddy boots, burnt bread, and all, Halloween had become a comfortable ritual. The saints were happy, the spirits were fed, and the villagers had learned to laugh at their fears. It was a golden era for ghosts. Unfortunately, it was a terrible one for women with good posture and an unusual number of cats, because just as the world was learning to enjoy a friendly scare, someone decided to make fear profitable. Enter the witch hunts, history's longest-running PR disaster. The idea of witches wasn't new. Even the Celts had whispered about women who could charm milk from a cow or curse your crops if you annoyed them. But for centuries, these figures existed in that grey area between respect and suspicion. Part healer, part hermit, part, please don't hex my goat. Samhain had always made space for them. They were, after all, the spiritual middle managers between humans and nature. Then came the late medieval church, armed with printing presses and a serious distrust of independent women. Somewhere between All Hallows' Eve and All Hell Breaks Loose, the church decided that witches weren't just eccentric. They were in league with Satan, and nothing ruins a holiday faster than theology with a grudge. The bonfires that once symbolized warmth and community began to change meaning. They still lit the night, but now they burned people. Fear shifted from the unknown to the unapproved. Every herbal remedy, every strange dream, every black cat that happened to sit on a windowsill became potential evidence. Even the weather joined in. A storm, a failed harvest, a sneeze in the wrong direction. All could be blamed on witchcraft. The irony, of course, was thick enough to stir with a cauldron. For centuries, Halloween had been about embracing the darkness, befriending it, giving it a lantern and a name. Now the darkness was something to be hunted, interrogated, and set on fire. The old healers, mostly women who actually knew how to treat wounds and grow herbs, found themselves recast as villains in someone else's morality play. Men, too, were occasionally accused, but women made more convenient scapegoats, cheaper, quieter, and statistically more likely to own cats. And cats, as everyone knows, have always been terrible at PR. Black cats in particular went from being beloved mouses to suspicious familiars, believed to serve witches as furry little spies. One meow at the wrong time, and your entire neighborhood might decide you were conspiring with demons. Poor cats. They never asked to be part of the drama. They just wanted snacks and somewhere warm to sleep, which, incidentally, is also what most witches wanted. The association between witches and cats grew so strong that even centuries later, the image stuck. To this day, no Halloween is complete without a black cat silhouetted against a moon, looking elegant and vaguely judgmental, as if it knows exactly how humans messed this one up. Back in the 15th and 16th centuries, though, it wasn't funny. The witch hysteria spread like wildfire, literally. What began as local gossip became a continental obsession. Theologians wrote manuals on how to identify witches. Spoiler: it mostly involved being female, old, or slightly competent. Villages turned inward. Neighbors eyed each other warily, and the laughter that once echoed through All Hallows' Eve grew quieter. But even then, the old habits wouldn't die. While officials preached about sin and sorcery, ordinary people still celebrated their small, harmless rituals. They still carved turnips. They still sang the old songs. They still whispered blessings over fires, though now they did it with the door shut and the curtains drawn, because deep down, they knew the difference between faith and fear. And maybe that's what kept Halloween alive when so many other folk traditions faded. It adapted. When fear became weaponized, Halloween learned to wear it as armor. The masks, once meant to fool ghosts, now served to mock the absurdities of human paranoia. People dressed as witches not to worship them, but to reclaim them, to take back the power that had been stolen through centuries of suspicion. Even today, every pointy hat and broomstick on October 31st carries a small, quiet rebellion. A reminder that what once terrified the world can now be laughed at safely in the light of a porch lantern. The witch, once condemned, is now the life of the party, and somewhere a black cat yawns approvingly. It's strange, isn't it? How easily fear changes costumes. How one century's symbol of danger becomes another symbol of independence. Halloween, ever adaptable, absorbed even its darkest chapter and turned it into something human again. A joke, a costume, a wink at history, because that's what the holiday had always done. Take fear, boil it down, and serve it with laughter. The fires that once consumed lives now flicker harmlessly in pumpkins. The chants that once summoned accusations now summon candy. And if the spirits of those old witches still wander the October night, they probably do so with a smirk. Because after everything, they won. They outlived their hunters. They became icons, and they still look fantastic in black. By the time Halloween crossed the ocean, it had already survived Romans, saints, witch hunts, and centuries of inconsistent spelling. But it wasn't until it reached America that the holiday truly found its most important ingredient: an identity crisis with a side of pumpkin. It arrived quietly, tucked into the hearts and suitcases of Irish and Scottish immigrants who brought with them their songs, their superstitions, and a strong sense that late October wasn't complete without fire, mischief, and something round with a candle inside. In the mid-1800s, as ships spilled over with families fleeing famine and seeking new lives, they also carried old ghosts. These immigrants landed in a strange new world that didn't quite understand them. A world of new languages, wide fields, and suspiciously cheerful corn festivals. But wherever Irish hands built homes, Halloween followed, stubborn as smoke. In the early days, it looked much the same as it had back home. Children going door to door asking for food or coins, teenagers pulling harmless pranks, families lighting candles to remember their dead. Only the materials had changed. Turnips, the traditional choice for carving lanterns, were suddenly out of the question. The American variety was enormous and uncooperative, the size of a small boulder and twice as solid. But then someone somewhere, probably after several failed attempts and a lot of swearing, noticed the local alternative, pumpkins, and thus began one of the most successful cross-cultural adaptations in history. Pumpkins were native to the Americas, bright, hollow, and easy to carve. They were nature's pre-approved lantern material. Their thick orange skins glowed beautifully in firelight, like tiny suns rising from the earth. To the Irish, who had grown up carving gnarled little faces into knobbly turnips to ward off spirits, this was a revelation. Why wrestle with root vegetables, they must have thought, when you can decapitate the moon? Soon, the pumpkin became the face of Halloween, literally. Farmers who had once ignored them as livestock feed began growing them for decoration. Markets filled with orange piles so bright they made autumn itself look underdressed. What had once been a humble harvest crop turned into a cultural celebrity. The first carved pumpkins, or jack-o'-lanterns, named after an old Irish ghost story, appeared on American porches in the 1800s. According to legend, the name came from a man called Stingy Jack, a trickster who managed to cheat both the devil and death. As punishment, he was doomed to wander the earth forever, his only light a glowing ember carried inside a hollowed-out turnip. When that tale reached American soil, Jack upgraded. The turnip became a pumpkin, the ember became a candle, and the symbol of the damned became surprisingly cozy. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the new holiday. Some early Americans viewed it as suspiciously foreign, too Catholic, too Celtic, or simply too noisy. But the kids didn't care. They saw the candles glowing through pumpkin faces and declared it awesome. And as history has repeatedly proven, if children like something enough, adults will eventually monetize it. By the late 19th century, Halloween in America had gone mainstream. Town newspapers printed safe activities to replace mischief. Churches hosted community parties with bobbing for apples and costume contests. Pumpkins became a symbol not just of misrule, but of unity. Something that everyone could carve, no matter their religion, accent, or preferred method of terrifying the neighbours. Even the pranks evolved. In Ireland, Halloween, mischief often involved tipping over carts or knocking on doors and running away. In America, it escalated into full-blown trickery season. Outhouses mysteriously relocated, wagons dismantled and reassembled on rooftops, and fence gates rearranged like a rural Rubik's Cube. People called it Cabbage Night or Mischief Night, depending on where you lived, and it was as inevitable as gravity. The spirits might have been imaginary, but the chaos was very real. Meanwhile, pumpkins kept multiplying, in fields, in recipes, and in imagination. By the early 1900s, pumpkin carving was an art form. Communities held contests. Children competed for whose lanterns could glow the brightest or grin the creepiest. And as electric lights arrived, so did safety. Fewer fires, more creativity, and a lot more orange. It's strange to think about how a vegetable became a cultural ambassador. The Celts had their fire, the Romans had their apples, the church had its saints, but America had marketing. The pumpkin didn't just survive, it conquered. It turned Halloween from a night of reverence into a full-color celebration. What began as a way to frighten spirits away had become a way to welcome them, brightly, warmly, with cinnamon and pie. By the 20th century, Halloween was no longer a European curiosity. It was a full-blown American export, a festival of light and laughter, equal parts nostalgia and sugar rush. And at the center of it all, sitting proudly on every porch, glowed the pumpkin, plump, harmless, and perfectly round, like the smiling face of a ghost that had finally decided to stick around. Because maybe that's what Halloween really is. A story that refuses to die. It just keeps changing shape. From bonfire to candle, from turnip to pumpkin, from prayer to party. Always glowing, always watching, always reminding us that light, no matter how small, looks best when it's surrounded by the dark. By the time the pumpkin took over America, the bonfire had been demoted. Once, it was the heartbeat of Halloween, a mountain of flame visible for miles, linking heaven and earth in a single roar of light. Now, it was a backyard accessory tucked behind the garage, politely contained in a metal drum from the hardware store. It's not that people stopped loving fire. They just learned to respect zoning laws. The ancient Celts had built their bonfires on open hillsides to guide the dead and scare away what they couldn't name. Now, suburban parents built theirs beside lawn chairs to roast marshmallows and talk about mortgage rates. Same idea, really. Warmth against the dark, just with fewer sacrifices and more s'mores. But the bonfire never truly disappeared. It merely downsized. The spirit of it, that primal need to gather around flame when the air turns sharp, still flickered in every backyard pit, every jack-o'-lantern, every sparkler handed to a sleepy child on a chilly night. Because, deep down, humanity never stopped needing its little pieces of sun. If you look closely, you can trace the whole evolution of civilization through how we light our fires. The Celts stacked logs on sacred hills. The Victorians built tidy piles in their gardens and called it celebrating the season. And by the mid-20th century, Americans had turned it into something even more organized. The community bonfire, part safety demonstration, part social event, part excuse to gossip under the stars. In small towns across the country, Halloween became a calendar event, printed neatly between Harvest Fair and Thanksgiving Parade. Police departments supervised. Local dads, self-appointed pyromancers, brought their pickup trucks full of wood. Mothers baked pies for the bake sale table, which somehow always ended up dangerously close to the fire. And around the great blaze, children circled in homemade costumes, clutching paper cups of cider, eyes wide in the orange glow. If Samhain had been a whisper to the gods, this was its echo. Louder, cheerier, and occasionally sponsored by the Rotary Club. Yet, in its own way, it was still sacred. There's something ancient in the way people fall quiet in front of flame, no matter how civilized they think they are. A hush comes over even the rowdiest crowd as sparks rise into the night. For a moment, the bonfire becomes what it always was, a reminder that warmth is borrowed, not guaranteed. That light, to mean anything, must always be surrounded by dark. It's funny to think that the same fire which once symbolized survival now symbolized comfort. The same ritual that once purified cattle now toasted hot dogs. But maybe that's progress. Not forgetting the past, just rewriting it in smaller, safer handwriting. Halloween in the 20th century became the domestic version of the old ritual. Instead of gathering on hilltops, people gathered on porches. Instead of chanting to the gods, they chatted with the neighbors. Instead of spirits drifting through the mist, there were kids in plastic masks, wandering in packs under the flicker of streetlights. The bonfire had become a neighborhood, a ring of tiny, contained lights glowing behind curtains, on doorsteps, in pumpkins. A constellation of human hope mapped onto suburbia. And while the New World's fires were smaller, they burned more evenly. There was no fear of the dark gods, no desperate plea for the sun's return. Just laughter, sugar, and a faint sense of mystery that no one could quite explain, but everyone still felt. Some primal part of us still recognized the rhythm. This is the time when things end, when the year exhales, when we remember that life and death have always danced together by the fire. Even the rituals persisted, disguised as leisure. We still light candles against the night. We still tell ghost stories while staring into flames. We still pass food and drink in circles, comforting ourselves with the warmth of company. The only difference is the soundtrack. Where once there were flutes and chanting, now there's the hiss of a Bluetooth speaker struggling to connect. But watch closely at any Halloween gathering. The way people lean toward the fire, not away from it. The way faces glow in that ancient orange light. It's the same as it ever was. Every spark is an echo of some ancestor's bonfire on a windy hill in Ireland. Every burst of laughter is another offering to the dark, not of fear, but of joy. The old Celts had hoped their fires would protect them through the winter. Maybe ours do too, just differently. We light them to protect our sanity from the cold routines of adulthood, to remember that there's still magic in the world, that even in a backyard filled with plastic ghosts and folding chairs, something ancient still flickers. And when the fire burns low and the night grows quiet, there's always that same feeling that's been here for thousands of years, the warmth fading, the dark returning, and the strange, comforting thought that it's okay, because the fire will be lit again next year. The stories will be told again. The pumpkins will glow again. From bonfire to backyard, the ritual endures. Smaller now, yes, but still alive, still whispering to the dark, still reminding us that every ember, no matter how tiny, is a promise. We're still here, still laughing, still warm against the cold. Every October, when the nights start tasting like wood smoke and the air begins to hum in that specific way, crisp, quiet, expectant, people still whisper about it. The veil, that invisible curtain between worlds, thinning with the season, letting the living and the dead swap stories for one night before everything closes again. For centuries, it was magic. Now, of course, we call it weather. But maybe those ancient Celts weren't as far off as we like to think. Because even with all our science, there's still something uncanny about the air around Halloween, as if the world's holding its breath, waiting for something just out of sight. Let's start with the obvious. October is a month of transitions. Daylight shrinks, shadows grow, the air cools, water condenses, and mist rises from the ground like a special effect designed by Mother Nature for dramatic storytelling. The Celts didn't need meteorology to notice this. They could feel it in their bones, the pressure dropping, the silence lengthening. Fog, for instance, was once seen as proof that spirits were near, and in a way, they were right. Fog happens when warm breath meets cold air, the living meeting the dead of night. Stand in a Celtic field at dawn, and you'd swear the world itself was exhaling. Even the colours of autumn feed the illusion. Those golds, reds and browns that make every forest look like it's burning quietly from the inside. That's not life, it's surrender. The chlorophyll breaks down, the green drains away, and what remains is the skeleton of summer, glowing beautifully on its way out. To the Celts, that transformation looked like magic. To us, it's chemistry. To anyone paying attention, it's both. And then there's sound. In summer, the air is thick and busy, buzzing, chirping, alive. But by late October, much of that sound dies away. The temperature drops, the insects vanish, and the world starts to echo differently. Your footsteps carry farther. The wind whistles through bare branches. The rustle behind you suddenly sounds a little too intentional. It's not spirits, it's acoustics. But tell that to someone walking home after dark with a candle and a guilty conscience. Even our brains join in the fun. Neuroscientists say we're wired to see patterns, to find faces in shadows and meaning in randomness. It's a survival mechanism. Better to mistake a bush for a bear than the other way around. On long, dark nights, that instinct ramps up. Our imaginations go into overdrive, powered by adrenaline and a lack of decent lighting. The result? Ghosts. Or, as psychology calls them, unresolved input. Still, science can't quite explain the feeling. That ancient, electric sense that something bigger is standing just behind the world, breathing softly down your neck. Because maybe it's not the dead returning. Maybe it's the living finally paying attention. Halloween sits perfectly on the fault line between seasons, a natural tipping point. It's when animals start migrating, plants retreat underground, and the air itself seems to fold inward. Nature is full of thresholds like that. Dawn and dusk, high tide and low, winter and spring. And humans have always been obsessed with them. We build myths where boundaries blur, because that's where possibility hides. Anthropologists call Samhain a liminal festival, from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. Liminal moments are when rules loosen, when identities shift, when transformation feels possible. That's why people dressed as ghosts, swapped roles, and told stories that mixed the real and unreal. The Celts didn't need microscopes or physics to know that the world behaved strangely in between. They could feel it, and maybe we still do. You can call it magnetism, humidity, or nostalgia. That doesn't make it less real. Every culture senses it, names it differently, and builds a ritual around it. The Japanese have Obon, the Mexicans have Dia de los Muertos, and the Irish had Samhain. Each one a way to nod at the mystery and say, "We see you. You can come closer, just for tonight." Modern people still chase that same shimmer. We light candles for ambience, carve faces into fruit, and queue up horror movies. All mild attempts to recreate that thrill of standing at the edge of something infinite. The difference is, now we tell ourselves it's for fun, but deep down, we know it's still reverence. Science may have explained the world, but it hasn't made it less strange. When night falls on Halloween and the wind slips under doors and whispers through the cracks. Even the most rational among us pause, just for a moment, just long enough to feel that ancient instinct stir, the one that says, "The veil is thin tonight, listen." And if you do, if you stand outside, breathe in the cold, and let your eyes adjust to the dark, you'll notice something subtle. The way the stars flicker slower, the way the trees seem to lean closer, the way your heart beats a little louder in your ears. That's not magic, strictly speaking. That's physics, biology, meteorology, and also, of course, magic. Because the world has always had layers, molecules and mysteries, atoms and awe. The Celts built a festival to honor that. We built a holiday to remember it. Either way, the point remains the same. Every now and then, life lets us peek through the cracks and the universe winks back. Before there were satellites, storm radars, or awkward men pointing at maps on television, people had druids, and occasionally a suspiciously confident grandmother to tell them when it was going to rain. And nowhere was weather watching more serious than in the season of Samhain. To the Celts, October wasn't just spooky, it was strategic. The next few months would decide whether your family thrived, starved, or froze, while trying not to admit either was happening. Winter was coming. Not the poetic kind, but the hope you like turnips kind. So when Samhain arrived, it doubled as an ancient forecasting festival. Between the feasts and the ghost diplomacy, people tried to predict what the next half of the year would bring. Would the winter be mild or cruel? Would the crops return? Would that one neighbor finally stop borrowing your sheep? The answers, of course, came from the sky, or failing that, from whoever could convincingly pretend to understand it. Druids, those spiritual multitaskers, were the closest thing ancient Europe had to meteorologists. They didn't have instruments, but they did have bonfires, patience, and an uncanny ability to look serious while staring at clouds. During Samhain, they'd interpret omens in the way flames bent, how smoke drifted, or which direction the first snowflakes fell. It was less science and more vibe check for the atmosphere. If the fire crackled high and clear, it meant a calm season ahead. If it hissed and spat, storms were coming. If it went out completely, everyone pretended that was fine and absolutely not an omen of doom. Thank you. Of course, everyone else had their own methods. Farmers watched the moon. If it rose yellow and hazy, the winter would be wet. If it glowed sharp and white, frost was on the way. Housewives looked to the behavior of animals. Cows huddling too close together meant snow. Birds flying low meant wind. And cats licking their paws in a clockwise motion meant you should probably bring in the laundry. Some methods were wonderfully creative. People burned bundles of herbs and counted the sparks to divine the length of the cold season. Others filled bowls with water, left them outside overnight, and checked for ice in the morning. An early prototype of the weather app, except you couldn't refresh it, and it involved fewer ads. Behind the rituals was a simple, universal anxiety. What's next? That's the human question we've never outgrown. And Samhain, perched perfectly on the edge between seasons, was the moment when that question hummed the loudest. The fields were bare, the days short, the wind full of that eerie rustling sound that makes even atheists consider lighting a candle, just in case. So the Celts lit their candles, hundreds of them, and asked the world to speak back. The fire was both a prayer and a barometer. The sky, both a mystery and a mirror. When they stared into the flames, they weren't just seeing omens. They were watching time itself, trying to read its next line. Even centuries later, the habit stuck. By the Middle Ages, people were still performing small acts of homegrown forecasting on Halloween night. Children would toss nuts into the fire and listen to how they burned. A steady flame meant good fortune. A loud pop meant trouble. Probably not coincidentally, this was also how early Europe discovered popcorn. Young women, ever the optimists of folklore, used Halloween to predict marriage. Drop an apple peel over your shoulder. If it landed in the shape of a letter, that was your future husband's initial. Peel breaks in half. Sorry, eternal spinsterhood. Clouds covering the moon. You'll marry a farmer. Clear sky. Someone with teeth. It all sounds quaint now, but back then, the stakes were real. Every superstition was just data wearing a flower crown. When you live in a world where a bad harvest can kill, intuition is a survival tool. The rituals gave people a sense of control, or at least the comforting illusion of it. And maybe that's why these old forecasting traditions never truly vanished. Even today, we still perform our own little acts of weather divination. We tap the screen, check the forecast, squint at the sky, and mutter. It doesn't look like rain, just before it immediately rains. We're still druids with better lighting. Modern meteorologists, if you think about it, are just druids with data. They read signals from the heavens, interpret the movement of air and light, and stand confidently in front of an audience pretending the gods, satellites, aren't laughing at them. The rituals are different, but the impulse is identical. To tame uncertainty with story, pattern, and spectacle. And when Halloween night rolls around and the air feels a little too still, the clouds a little too low, we still do what our ancestors did. Look up. We watch the sky for signs. We breathe in the cold, and we tell each other stories about what it all might mean. Because maybe Samhain was never really about predicting the weather. Maybe it was about predicting ourselves, how we'd handle the next storm, the next winter, the next unknown thing waiting beyond the edge of the firelight. In that sense, every Halloween forecast has always been correct. The dark is coming, but don't worry. You've got light company and just enough superstition to keep you warm. If you've ever listened to rain against a window on a cold night and felt strangely safe, like the world is whispering around you instead of at you, congratulations. You already understand the spirit of Samhain. For the Celts, rain wasn't an inconvenience. It was background music. It blurred the edges of things, hills, houses, people, and made the world feel softer, smaller, closer. And when the nights grew long and the fires grew dim, there was only one proper way to spend an evening like that. Telling stories. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. A way to pass the time, yes, but also a way to remember who you were when the world outside seemed to forget. When the harvest was over and the weather decided it had artistic ambitions, the Celts gathered indoors. Families, friends, neighbours, the occasional confused sheep, all pressed together under roofs that creaked like old bones. The air smelled of smoke, wet wool, and roasted barley. The hearth crackled. Someone stirred the embers with a stick, and someone else began to talk. At first, the stories were simple. Tales of the harvest, of the neighbour's cow that could climb fences, of small victories and big mistakes. But as the night deepened and the wind began to hum down the chimney, the stories changed. They became stranger, longer, older. Because on Samhain night, you didn't just tell stories about the spirits, you told them to them. Each tale was both offering and invitation. You spoke of heroes who defeated death, of lovers reunited across worlds, of ghosts who forgot they were ghosts and just wanted to come home for one more meal. And somewhere in the dark, it was believed the listeners weren't all human. Sometimes the fire would hiss suddenly, as if something unseen had leaned in a bit too close. Sometimes a gust of wind would rattle the door, and the storyteller would smile knowingly. "Ah," they'd say, "they're listening tonight." It wasn't fear that kept everyone hushed, it was respect. The Celts believed that spirits loved a good story as much as anyone, and that silence was the proper applause. If the tale pleased them, you might feel a soft breeze across your face, or hear a sigh that wasn't yours. If not, well, best to tell another one quickly, just in case. There was rhythm to it, a rise and fall of voices, the crackle of wood, the tap of rain on thatch. People dozed, laughed, stirred the fire again. Grandmother might recite an old charm. A child might add a line to a story halfway through, because children are like that. No one corrected them. After all, this was how myths grew. The same way fire spreads, quietly, naturally, from one spark to the next. Even the weather joined in. The rain against the roof became percussion. The wind outside became a narrator of its own. When thunder rolled over the hills, it wasn't a storm. It was a giant shifting in its sleep, or the gods drumming their approval. And if lightning flashed, it wasn't frightening. It was applause from the sky. Centuries later, when the written word took over, people called these stories mythology. But back then, they were simply the news, the emotional weather report of the human soul. You didn't just believe them, you lived them. Every name, every moral, every bit of exaggeration carried the warmth of shared breath in a cold room. And when the stories ended, as all good stories must, there was always that quiet moment afterward, the kind where the only sound was the last crackle of the fire, the drip of rain, and the faint rhythm of someone's heartbeat slowing towards sleep. The storyteller would smile faintly, glance at the window, and murmur something like, "Well, that should keep the spirits happy till morning." It wasn't bravado, it was routine. 1,000 years of people talking their way through fear, turning uncertainty into narrative, darkness into words. Because when you name something, it stops being a monster and starts being a character. And characters, at least, can be understood. The Celts might not have had books, but they had something better: community memory. Every story told during Samhain became a thread in the great woven blanket of identity, one that kept generations warm long after the tellers were gone. Even today, we're still wrapped in it. Every ghost story told by flashlight, every urban legend whispered at sleepovers, every movie watched through half-closed eyes. It's all the same ritual. Firelight replaced by LED, but the purpose unchanged. To remind ourselves that we're still part of something ancient and ongoing. That fear is manageable when shared. That laughter and storytelling are the same thing as courage, just wearing a different mask. So if you find yourself on a rainy October night, listening to the steady drumming on the window and the distant sigh of wind in the trees, take comfort. That sound isn't loneliness, it's history. It's every Samhain hearth still burning somewhere in the back of the human mind. A chorus of stories murmuring to the dark, keeping it friendly and just scary enough to be interesting. Every harvest is a gamble. You plant seeds and hope they grow. You pray the weather behaves, and by autumn, you discover whether the gods were in a generous mood or just feeling experimental. For the ancient Celts, Samhain was that moment of truth, Wesogul, when the gamble paid off or didn't, It was the end of the agricultural year, and the mood was complicated. Relief mixed with dread, gratitude tangled with worry. The fields stood empty, the barns full, and everyone tried not to think too hard about how long those stores would last. They called it the time of reaping and reckoning, and that phrase could apply to both crops and conscience. Because the Celts weren't just harvesting grain, they were harvesting meaning. Each stalk cut, each animal slaughtered, each ember fading from the great fire was a reminder that life itself was a seasonal thing. The world slept, woke, thrived, and died on repeat. And humans, for all their pride, were just another crop. It's strange to imagine now, in an age where food arrives plastic-wrapped and pre-apologized for. But for the Celts, survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned. Every loaf of bread in winter carried the memory of sweat and soil. Every breath of warmth owed itself to firewood chopped months before. And every silence between wind gusts was an opportunity to wonder whether the gods were still listening. Fear was part of the harvest. Not an accident, but a necessity. It kept people humble, alert, thankful. It reminded them that plenty and peril were never far apart, that the same land that fed them could bury them if neglected. So when Samhain arrived, fear was welcomed, not as an enemy, but as a guest of honor. They built fires not just for warmth, but to stare into and reflect. They told stories not just for fun, but to rehearse bravery. Even their games, bobbing for apples, tossing nuts into flames, were small rituals of risk and reward. Fear wasn't something to escape, it was something to harvest. They called it the thinning, that sense of the world breathing differently. You could feel it in your chest, that tug between comfort and uncertainty. The exact same feeling you get today when a thunderstorm hits just as you turn off all the lights. It's unsettling, but also beautiful. That's what Samhain was. Humanity's oldest celebration of mixed feelings. At the heart of it all was a quiet kind of gratitude. They thanked the earth for what it gave and forgave it for what it took. They thanked the animals who'd been slaughtered and promised their spirits safe passage to whatever afterlife included better grazing. Even the tools, the sickles, the grinding stones, the plows, were honored and put away for rest, like tired workers at the end of a long season. It's easy to think of Samhain as a night of ghosts and goblins, but really, it was a night of accounting. Every family measured what they had, food, fuel, loved ones, and hoped it would be enough. When it wasn't, they sang louder, laughed harder, and pretended not to notice the hunger in their stories. And maybe that's why Halloween still feels a little bittersweet, no matter how much candy we add to it. Somewhere beneath the sugar rush and party lights, we can still feel that flicker of ancient unease. The quiet reminder that comfort is temporary, and life, for all its noise, is delicate. But that doesn't make it sad. It makes it real. Fear, the Celts understood, wasn't the opposite of joy. It was its partner. Without the cold, warmth has no meaning. Without darkness, light is just glare. And without the yearly reminder that the world is bigger, wilder, and less predictable than we think, we might forget to be grateful when it's kind. So they harvested everything: grain, apples, stories, laughter, fear, and stored it all away for the winter. Because fear, in small doses, is a kind of fuel. It sharpens you, it humbles you, and ironically, it keeps you alive. When the fires died down and the villagers drifted home, the night swallowed the land whole. The stars hung low and heavy, and the wind carried the faint smell of earth and ash. In the fields, the stubble of cut wheat glistened like silver in the moonlight, the bones of summer picked clean and beautiful. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The work was done, the offerings made, the veil was closing, and somewhere in the dark, the ancestors were retreating, satisfied, full, and probably mildly tipsy, and the people, for their part, curled into their beds with full bellies and empty thoughts. Outside, the rain began again, soft and endless, drumming on the roof like applause for a show that would be performed again next year. Because that's what Samhain really was. A rehearsal for survival. A story we keep telling every autumn, that endings are never just endings, and fear, when faced with grace, becomes something almost gentle. If you live long enough through autumn, something curious happens. You stop fighting the dark. You start to miss it when it's gone. The Celts understood this instinct better than anyone. They lived half their lives in shadow, not metaphorical shadow, actual, can't see your own cow shadow. And yet, instead of fearing it, they folded it into their rhythm. Darkness, to them, wasn't an absence of light. It was a season, a pause, a homecoming. When the fires of Samhain burned out and the last smoke drifted toward the stars, what remained wasn't dread. It was quiet, the kind that hums softly in the chest, like a held breath. The villagers didn't rush to fill it with noise. They let it settle. The fields went still, the tools were stored, and for the first time in months, nobody was running late for anything. The dark, it turned out, was merciful. Modern life teaches us to fear silence, to fill it with screens, playlists, notifications and noises that prove we're still awake. But to the Celts, winter's silence was sacred. It was the earth closing its eyes for a while. The animals burrowed, the soil rested, the people told stories and slept longer. Everything that lived exhaled at once. It was a kind of faith, to trust that the light would return without forcing it, that even in the cold, something warm was quietly gathering strength below the frost. They didn't need to see proof. They felt it, the same way we know spring is coming, even when the calendar insists otherwise. And maybe that's why darkness never scared them as much as it fascinates us, because they understood it wasn't the enemy, it was the other half of the conversation. Light without dark is exhausting. You can't see stars at noon. You can't measure warmth without cold. You can't grow without resting, even if the world keeps pretending you can. When night fell over the Celtic hills, it didn't feel like a void. It felt like velvet, soft, enormous, filled with the quiet breathing of ancestors and unseen gods. The fires didn't banish it. They belonged to it. A tiny flame is meaningless without something vast to glow against. There's an old Irish proverb: the darkest night is the mother of the brightest morning. It sounds poetic, but it was also practical advice for anyone freezing in a hut, waiting for the sun to show up again. The Celts didn't romanticize darkness. They respected it. It was both the grave and the womb, the ending and the seed. Maybe that's why Halloween, centuries later, still feels strangely comforting. It's not just the candy or the costumes or the glow of pumpkins in the dark. It's the reminder that there's beauty in the shadows, that hiding under blankets is as sacred as dancing around fires, that the unknown isn't always a threat. Sometimes it's just mystery, waiting for you to stop squinting. There's a moment every autumn, just before winter takes over, when the air feels heavy but gentle, like the world is tucking itself in. That's the moment Samhain was made for. A collective sigh, a slowing of the pulse, a reminder that even the sun needs to rest. In our bright, overlit world, it's easy to forget how restorative the dark can be. We've turned it into a villain in every story. Dark times, dark deeds, dark moods. But the Celts would have rolled their eyes at that. They didn't think darkness was evil. They thought it was honest. The day hides nothing, but the night hides everything. And sometimes, that's exactly what you need. Maybe that's why Halloween still draws us outside when it should send us in. We light candles. We walk beneath the moon. We fill the shadows with laughter. We do what humans have always done when faced with the infinite. We decorate it, humanize it, dare it to scare us. And when it doesn't, we realize we were never really afraid, just lonely for something bigger than daylight. Because the truth is, the dark feels like home precisely because it always has been. Every one of us began there, before the world, before words, before light. Darkness isn't the opposite of life. It's where life starts, where seeds wait, where dreams grow, where ancestors sleep. And so, as the Celts settled into their long winters, they didn't curse the night. They thanked it. They saw it as a gift, a time to reflect, to gather strength, to let the world do its slow, invisible magic. When they lit their fires, they weren't fighting the dark. They were greeting it, like an old friend returning after a long, bright summer. And maybe that's what Halloween still whispers to us, through all the costumes and laughter, that it's okay to stop shining for a while, to rest, to dim the lights and let the world hum softly around you. Because the dark isn't empty, it's full of memory and warmth, and the promise that even when everything sleeps, something somewhere is still awake, watching over the fires, counting the stars, and waiting patiently for you to close your eyes. And so, here we are. The fires dimmed, the pumpkins sagging slightly, the ghosts politely excusing themselves to return to whatever spectral Wi-Fi network they came from. The year has turned once more. Samhain, Halloween, All Hallows Eve, whatever name you give it, has done its job again, reminding the living that endings are just beginnings wearing a better cloak. The bonfires are ash now, grey and whispering. If you stir them, you'll see the last little flecks of red, warm hearts beating under the dust, refusing to go quietly. The same fire that once called to gods and ancestors now calls you to bed, because the season for action is over. The season for dreaming has begun. It's funny, isn't it? All through history, people have lit things on fire to understand the dark. They've told stories to understand fear. They've worn masks to understand themselves. And every time, when the flames finally died, they found the same thing waiting for them in the quiet. Peace. A fragile, flickering peace that said, "You made it through another year." The Celts would have called this moment the turning, when the wheel of time creaks forward a notch and the world breathes out. They believed the air between Samhain and sunrise was sacred, that if you listened closely enough, you could hear time itself pause before continuing on its way. Maybe they were right. Maybe that's the sound you're hearing now, the slow exhale of a world taking stock of itself. Outside, the wind is still wandering. The leaves have given up pretending to hold on. And somewhere, a fox crosses a field, its paws making no sound at all. It doesn't know what Halloween is. It just knows the same thing you do, that this is the time of year when the world feels thin and tender, when everything sleeps with one eye open. The ghosts have gone, but they leave the air feeling full, like laughter in a room long after the party's over. They'll be back, of course. They always come back, not to haunt, but to remind us that time is porous, and love, once felt, never really fades. Think about it. The same fire that once burned on the Celtic hills now flickers in your living room candle. The same moon that watched over druids and saints and superstitious farmers still shines through your window. You are sitting in the same story, just a few chapters later. All of this, every tradition and superstition and pumpkin on a porch, began with a single, simple act. People trying to make sense of the dark, trying to find beauty in endings, trying to stay warm. And maybe that's why Halloween feels so good, why the chill in the air feels more comforting than cruel. Because we've been here before, all of us, in one form or another. We've stood around the fire and told stories about the dead, knowing full well that someday, someone else will be telling stories about us. And somehow, that thought isn't sad. It's home. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it. The long line of humanity stretching back through the centuries, each generation holding a little light, each one passing it to the next. Bonfire to candle, candle to lantern, lantern to string light. The flame changes shape, but it never goes out. It just moves closer to where you are now, quietly burning in the palm of your hand. That's what Samhain was always about. Not ghosts, not monsters, not even death, but continuity. The knowledge that the world keeps turning, that warmth returns, that stories outlast silence. The Celts called it faith. We might call it habit. But really, it's the same thing. So as you sit there listening to whatever night sounds fill your corner of the world, the hum of a heater, the rain on glass, maybe even the sigh of the wind, remember that you're part of that ancient rhythm, the one that begins with fear and ends in laughter, the one that burns, cools and burns again, the one that has always known how to lull us into peace when the year grows tired, because this is the moment the world has been working toward, the soft landing after all the stories, the silence after the drum, the warmth after the fear. This is the part of the year that says, it's okay to stop now. Let the night have its turn. Let the darkness do its work. It's been waiting all year for you to close your eyes. The fire's last glow trembles, steady and small, like a heartbeat you can see. The wind curls around the house, a lullaby in disguise. And somewhere, in that tender space between waking and sleep, the old spirits smile. Their job is done for now. You're safe. You're warm. You've listened. Tomorrow the world will begin again, the way it always does. But for now, rest. Let the last embers fade. Let the smoke find the stars. Let the year tuck itself in around you like a blanket woven from 1,000 remembered nights. And as the darkness settles in, remember, the fire isn't gone. It's just sleeping, like you, waiting for spring. Good night, and happy Samhain.